"Uncle, don't take off the plane," girl shouts. 5 minutes later, this happens. Emma ran with all the strength her 10-year-old legs could muster, her brown hair flying loose as her hands desperately gripped the wire fence separating her from the airport runway. The white and red plane was already moving, and she could clearly see her Uncle Michael in the cockpit, adjusting the controls for takeoff. "Uncle Michael, don't take off!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, shaking the metal fence with a deafening clatter. "Please don't go." The sound of the twin-engine plane's motor drowned out her desperate cries. Tears streamed down her face, red from exertion, as she kept shouting and waving frantically. Her pink t-shirt clung to her body with sweat, and her white sneakers were already dirty from running across the grass at Riverside Regional Airport. The pilot couldn't see or hear her. Michael Peterson, 42 years old, was focused on preparing for yet another work trip. As a sales representative for agricultural equipment, he frequently flew to towns in rural Tennessee, and that Tuesday would be no different. He had meetings scheduled in Memphis and needed to arrive before 2 in the afternoon. Emma knew that in just a few minutes she would lose her chance forever to tell her uncle what she had discovered the night before. Something that would completely change his life, but she hadn't been able to explain it that morning because he had left the house too early, before she even woke up. The girl had stayed up all night, rummaging through old papers in the attic of the house she shared with Grandma Margaret, searching for old photos for a school project on family history. That was when she found a dusty box of documents that made her understand why her mother had fought so bitterly with Michael years ago, and why she had never spoken her brother's name again. "Uncle, wait!" she kept screaming, but the plane was already picking up speed on the runway. "I need to tell you something really important." Her hands ached from gripping the wire fence, but she couldn't stop shouting. She knew that if Michael took off right then, she might never have the courage to tell him what she had found. And worse, he would keep living without knowing the truth about what really happened to his biological father. The small Riverside Regional Airport had been operating since the 70s and was known by locals as a quiet place where small planes belonging to businessmen and farmers in the area made stops. That March morning, the sky was clear, with a few white clouds scattered across the blue horizon, and the wind blew gently, creating perfect flying conditions. Emma had woken up at 5 in the morning to the sound of her uncle getting ready for his trip. She rushed to the kitchen of Grandma Margaret's house, where the 3 of them lived, but found only a note stuck to the fridge. Left early. Back Thursday, love Uncle Mike." The girl's heart raced. She needed to tell him about the documents she'd found, but now she'd have to wait 2 whole days, unless she could catch him at the airport. Without a second thought, Emma grabbed her red bicycle and pedaled the 3 miles from her grandmother's house to the small airport. She arrived breathless and sweaty, leaned her bike against the fence, and ran, searching for her uncle's plane. "Please, God, don't let him leave yet," she whispered between shouts as she watched the aircraft positioning for takeoff. Michael had bought the used plane 5 years earlier when he decided to expand his business to other towns. It was a 1985 Skymaster 210, white with red trim, which he had learned to fly himself after taking an intensive course in New York. The aircraft could carry 6 passengers, but he usually traveled alone, carrying only samples of the equipment he sold. Inside the cockpit, Michael checked the instruments one last time before takeoff. He was eager to reach Memphis, hoping to close a major deal with a sugarcane growers cooperative. If he secured that sale, he could finally pay off the plane's financing and perhaps even expand the business further. The 42-year-old man had brown hair already graying at the temples, green eyes just like his niece's, and an easy smile that won his clients' trust. Ever since his sister Jennifer died in a car accident 3 years earlier, he had become Emma's only close relative, sharing with his mother, Mrs. Margaret, the responsibility of raising the girl. "Riverside Tower, this is N328KT requesting takeoff clearance," he said over the radio, adjusting his headphones. "N328KT, cleared for takeoff on runway 09, wind calm, visibility unlimited," replied the air traffic controller's voice. Emma watched the plane begin to accelerate and felt like she was losing the battle. Her strength was fading, but she couldn't give up. She was certain Uncle Michael needed to know the truth before he left. though she couldn't explain exactly why. She felt such a strong urgency. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The discovery Emma had made the night before would forever change Michael's understanding of his own life. In the documents she found in the attic, she learned that the man Michael believed to be his father was not his biological father. There were birth certificates, old letters, and even photos that told a completely different story from the one the family had always shared. Michael grew up believing his father, Robert Peterson, had abandoned the family when he was just 5 years old. Margaret always said the man was irresponsible and had run off with another woman, leaving her pregnant with Jennifer and a young son to raise. Because of this, Michael grew up with deep resentment toward his father and vowed never to be like that man. But the papers Emma found told a different story. Robert Peterson was not Michael's biological father. The child's real father was William James Wilson, a United States Air Force pilot who had died in a training accident 3 months before Michael was born. The letters Emma discovered showed that Margaret had married Robert while already pregnant, with William James's child, trying to provide a family for the baby she was expecting. Robert had accepted the boy as his own, but after a few years, when Jennifer was born, he began treating Michael differently, always making it clear the boy wasn't truly his son. The truth was, Robert hadn't abandoned the family out of irresponsibility. He had left after a huge fight with Margaret when he discovered she had kept letters and photos of Michael's real father hidden in the attic. Margaret had promised to forget William James and start a new life, but she couldn't keep that promise. In the letters William James wrote to Margaret before his death, he spoke of his dream of flying, how he loved the feeling of freedom in the cockpit, and how he hoped to teach his son to fly one day. He had even left behind a notebook with flight notes, hoping to pass that knowledge on to Michael someday. Emma understood that night that her uncle's passion for flying wasn't just a coincidence or a professional necessity. It was an inheritance from the father he had never known, an inexplicable connection to William James that manifested through the skies. But there was something else in the papers that left her even more desperate to tell Michael everything. Among the documents, she found a current address for Robert Peterson. The man hadn't disappeared as everyone thought. He had been living in Memphis for 15 years, working as an aircraft mechanic at the city's airport. "Don't go to Memphis," Emma shouted, with the last breath she had left, but the plane was already taking off. "He's there. Robert is there." What the girl didn't know was that Robert Peterson had spent all those years thinking about Michael and Jennifer, regretting how he had left home. He worked at the Memphis International Airport, precisely in the hope that one day he might find Michael, whom he knew had become a pilot through mutual acquaintances in Riverside. Robert had gathered the courage to search for his family a few times over the years, but he always backed out at the last moment, afraid he wouldn't be welcomed. He knew Margaret and the children probably hated him, and he didn't want to cause anyone more pain. Michael's plane quickly gained altitude, and Emma fell to her knees on the grass, crying in frustration. She knew that if her uncle landed in Memphis and happened to run into Robert, the shock could be devastating. Michael still carried so much resentment toward his stepfather that her mother, Jennifer, had once told her that her brother suffered recurring nightmares about abandonment. Jennifer had died without knowing the truth about the family's history. Margaret had never found the courage to tell her children that Robert wasn't Michael's biological father, afraid of complicating an already painful situation. She had kept the secret for over 30 years, and now only Emma knew everything. The girl stood up from the grass, wiped her tears with the sleeve of her pink t-shirt, and looked up at the sky, where the small dot of the plane was almost disappearing into the clouds. She knew she had to find a way to warn her uncle before it was too late. She ran back to her bicycle and pedaled as fast as she could toward her grandmother's house. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing lunch when Emma stormed in, breathless and with red eyes from crying. "Grandma, you have to help me," Emma said, gripping the 70-year-old woman's shoulders. "I found out about Uncle Michael's father." Margaret dropped the spoon she was holding and turned pale. Her brown eyes, already faded with age, widened in shock, and her wrinkled hands began to tremble. The petite woman, who had always remained strong in the face of hardship, suddenly seemed much more fragile. "What are you talking about, child?" she asked in a shaky voice, though she knew exactly what Emma meant. "I found the box in the attic, Grandma. I saw all of William James's letters, the photos, the real birth certificate. I know Robert isn't Uncle Michael's father," Emma said, pulling her grandmother to sit at the kitchen table. "And I know Robert is living in Memphis." Margaret took a deep breath and closed her eyes. All those years, she had prepared for the day she would have to tell the truth, but she had always imagined she would be the one to choose the moment. She never thought her 10-year-old granddaughter would uncover it all on her own. "How do you know he's in Memphis?" Margaret asked, trying to buy time to gather her thoughts. "I found a letter he sent 5 years ago. He works at the airport there, Grandma, and Uncle Michael just flew to Memphis today," Emma explained, her heart racing again. "If they meet without knowing anything, it's going to be awful." Margaret knew her granddaughter was right. Michael carried a deep anger toward Robert, who had actually been a good stepfather during the years they lived together. The problem was that their relationship had deteriorated when Michael entered adolescence and started asking questions about his biological father. Robert, unsure how to handle the situation, began to grow distant, and Margaret never knew how to explain the truth. "Grandma, we need to call Uncle Michael and tell him everything," insisted Emma, picking up the kitchen landline. "He needs to know the truth before he runs into Robert." "It's no use, sweetheart. Your uncle's phone doesn't get service during the flight," Margaret explained, feeling the weight of guilt pressing on her chest. "He'll only be able to call once he lands in Memphis." "Then we call the airport there," Emma suggested with the determination of someone who hasn't yet learned that not all problems have easy solutions. "They can tell Uncle Mike when he lands." Margaret shook her head sadly. She knew airport staff couldn't pass personal messages to pilots, especially ones as delicate as this. Besides, she herself wasn't sure if she was ready for the whole truth to come out after so many years. "Emma, some things are more complicated than they seem," Margaret said, stroking her granddaughter's face. "I've kept these secrets for so long because I wanted to protect you all." "But it wasn't protection, Grandma, it was a lie," Emma shot back with the brutal honesty of a child. "Uncle Michael spent his whole life hating Robert without knowing he isn't even his real father. And Robert must be suffering too, thinking he was a terrible dad." The girl's words hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. She knew Emma was right, but she couldn't find the strength to undo years of silence and well-intentioned lies. All her life, Margaret had worked hard to be a good mother and grandmother, laboring as a seamstress to support the family after Robert left. She had raised Michael and Jennifer alone, never letting them go without basic necessities, even if it meant sacrificing her own desires. When Michael became a pilot and started working as a sales representative, Margaret was incredibly proud. She never made the connection between her son's passion for flying and the genetic inheritance from William James, because she had locked those memories deep in her heart decades ago. William James had been the great love of Margaret's life. They met when she was just 19 and he was 22, at a graduation party for mutual friends. He was finishing his military pilot training, and she worked as a secretary at a courthouse in Riverside. Their romance lasted 2 intense years, full of shared plans and dreams. William James constantly talked about flying, about the feeling of freedom he found in the skies, and how he wanted to raise a family and teach his children to love aviation as much as he did. When Margaret found out she was pregnant, they were overjoyed. William James had already requested a transfer to an airbase closer to Riverside so he could be there for the pregnancy. He had even started setting up a nursery in the house he planned to rent after their wedding. But 3 months before Michael was born, William James died in an accident during a nighttime training flight. The military plane he was in suffered engine failure and crashed in a rural area near the airbase. Margaret received the news in her 7th month of pregnancy and nearly lost the baby from the shock. Robert Peterson had been William James's childhood friend. They had grown up in the same neighborhood in Riverside, played together in the streets, and remained close even after William James moved away to pursue a military career. When he learned of the tragedy, Robert was the first to offer help to Margaret, At first, Robert only visited Margaret to bring groceries and check on her, but gradually a genuine friendship developed between them. Margaret was devastated by the loss of William James, and Robert became her primary source of emotional support. When Michael was born, Robert was at the hospital. He was the one who took Margaret home and helped her through the difficult first months of caring for a newborn alone. Over time, he became a father figure to the boy, who never got to know William James. The marriage between Margaret and Robert took place when Michael was 2. It wasn't a passionate love match, but one born of deep affection and mutual need for companionship. Robert sincerely loved both Margaret and Michael and did his best to be the best husband and father he could be. Jennifer was born 3 years later, and for a while the family was genuinely happy. Robert worked as a mechanic at a shop in downtown Riverside. Margaret took care of the house and children, and on weekends they often had picnics in the city park. The trouble began when Michael turned 10 and started asking why he didn't look like Robert. The boy had inherited William James's green eyes and light brown hair, while Robert had dark brown eyes and black hair. Jennifer, on the other hand, looked very much like Robert. Margaret always dodged Michael's questions with vague answers, saying he took after his maternal grandparents. But as the boy grew older, his questions became more pointed and insistent. By 15, Michael went through a typical rebellious teenage phase, but it mainly manifested as a constant rejection of Robert's authority. He claimed Robert had no right to tell him what to do because he's not even my real dad. Robert tried to stay calm and understanding, but the situation became unbearable when Michael found out, through school friends, that his parents had married when he was already 2. The teenager began openly questioning whether Robert was his biological father. It was then that Margaret made the mistake that would forever change the family's dynamics. Afraid that Michael would discover the truth about William James and think she had betrayed his biological father's memory by marrying Robert, she invented a twisted version of the story. Margaret told Michael that Robert was his biological father, but had abandoned the family when he learned of the pregnancy, only returning years later to ask for a second chance. She said she had taken Robert back out of pity and because she needed help raising their son. The lie was devastating for everyone involved. Michael began treating Robert with coldness and contempt, believing the man who raised him was a coward who had shirked his responsibilities. Robert, for his part, didn't understand why Margaret had told that version of events, but didn't feel he had the right to question his wife's decisions. The tension at home became unbearable. Now that he knew the truth about his origins, Michael blamed Robert for all the family's problems. Jennifer, who was 12 at the time, was confused by the constant fights and tried to make peace between her brother and father. Robert began drinking in his free time, trying to numb the pain of being rejected by the son he had raised with so much love. Margaret felt guilty about the lie she had created, but didn't know how to undo the harm that was already done. The final straw came on a December night in 1995, when Michael was 17. During a particularly violent argument, the teenager shouted at Robert that he would never be his real father and that he wished he would leave forever. Robert, drunk and heartbroken, yelled back that since he wasn't welcome anymore, he would indeed leave. The next morning, Robert packed his bags and walked out. He left a letter for Margaret, apologizing for not being strong enough to endure the situation and promising he would continue sending money to help with household expenses. Margaret never showed the letter to Michael or Jennifer. Instead, she reinforced the lie she had created, telling them Robert had abandoned the family once again, proving he truly was an irresponsible and selfish man. Michael graduated high school with that certainty planted in his heart. He chose a career as a pilot by chance after seeing an ad for a flight school in New York. He never made the connection between his passion for the skies and the genetic legacy of William James because he didn't even know William James had existed. Now, 30 years later, Emma had uncovered the whole truth, and Margaret was faced with the possibility of finally correcting the mistakes of the past. But she also knew the revelation could destroy the image Michael had of her and shatter the emotional stability he had built over the years. "Grandma, we have to do something," Emma insisted, seeing Margaret lost in painful memories. "Uncle Michael will suffer terribly if he meets Robert without knowing anything." Margaret looked at her granddaughter and saw in her the same determination. William James used to show when he believed in a cause. The girl had inherited not only the green eyes of the grandfather she had never met, but also his stubbornness to do what was right, no matter the consequences. "All right, Emma. We'll try. To warn your uncle," Margaret said, rising slowly from her chair. "But first you have to promise me you'll help me explain everything to him, no matter what happens." Emma nodded vigorously, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. She knew she was about to change her family's life forever, but she was also certain the truth was better than continuing to live based on lies. Margaret picked up an old notebook and wrote down the number for Memphis International Airport, which she had memorized years earlier when she had considered calling to try to speak to Robert. She had never mustered the courage to make the call, but had kept the number as a lingering possibility. "Hello, Memphis International Airport," Margaret said into the phone, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'd like to leave a message for a pilot who's landing there this morning." The attendant explained that personal messages for pilots weren't possible, but Margaret insisted, saying it was a family emergency. After several minutes of back and forth, the employee agreed to take down the message and try to deliver it when the aircraft landed. "The message is for Michael Peterson, pilot of the Skymaster 210, tail number N328KT, Margaret said, her voice trembling. "Please tell him he needs to call home urgently before leaving the airport. It's about his father." When she hung up, Margaret sank heavily into the kitchen chair. She knew she had set in motion something irreversible, but for the first time in decades, she felt relieved not to have to carry the weight of so many secrets alone. Emma hugged her grandmother tightly, feeling she was finally doing something important to help the family she loved so much. She couldn't imagine how Uncle Michael would react upon discovering the truth, but she was certain he deserved to know who his father really was. Meanwhile, at 800 feet altitude, Michael was piloting his Skymaster, without suspecting his life was about to change completely. He was thinking about the meeting he would have in Memphis, mentally reviewing the arguments he'd used to convince the cooperative to buy the equipment he represented. The flight to Memphis took about 45 minutes, and Michael cherished this time alone in the skies to relax and organize his thoughts. Flying always had a therapeutic effect on him, as if the cockpit offered a peace he couldn't find on solid ground. He never questioned why he felt so at ease piloting, or why he'd adapted so quickly to aircraft controls during his training. To him, it was just a natural talent he'd discovered by chance, one that had become a useful work tool. What Michael didn't know was that his exceptional flying ability was a direct inheritance from William James, who had been considered one of the best pilots in his military academy class. William James had a natural intuition for understanding how an aircraft behaved under different flight conditions, and that same intuition had been genetically passed down to Michael. At 11:15 in the morning, Michael began his approach procedures for Memphis International Airport. The city stretched out below him, its green sugarcane fields alternating with urban areas, creating a colorful mosaic he always admired when flying over the region. "Memphis Tower, this is N328KT requesting landing clearance," he communicated over the radio, adjusting the aircraft's altitude. "N328KT, cleared to land on runway Aero 9, wind 120 degrees at 10 knots, replied the air traffic controller. Michael executed a smooth landing, taxied to the small aircraft parking area, and shut down the engines. He was pleased with the flight, which had gone without incident, and eager to get to the meeting that could change the course of his business. As he stepped out of the plane carrying his sample case, Michael didn't notice a man in his 60s watching him from a distance near the maintenance hangar. Robert Peterson had recognized the plane the moment it appeared on the horizon. For all those years working at the airport, he'd always paid attention to the small aircraft landing, secretly hoping one day to find the stepson he'd raised. Robert was grayer now with a few more wrinkles, but he remained the tall, strong man Michael remembered from childhood. He wore blue mechanic's overalls and held a wrench in his trembling hands, trying to decide whether to approach or keep watching from afar. For 15 years, Robert had rehearsed in his mind what he would say if he ever found Michael. He'd imagined dozens of versions of the conversation, from humble apologies to detailed explanations about why he'd left home. But now, seeing the grown man the boy had become, all words seemed inadequate. Michael walked toward the passenger terminal, where he planned to take a taxi downtown. He was lost in thought and didn't realize he was being watched by someone who recognized every one of his mannerisms, a legacy of the years Robert had raised him as his own son. Just as Michael was about to enter the terminal, an airport administration employee hurried over. "Excuse me, are you Michael Peterson?" the woman asked, checking a note on her clipboard. "Yes, I am. Is something wrong?" Michael replied, immediately concerned. "There's an urgent message for you, sir. A lady called asking to let you know that you need to call home before leaving the airport. She said it's about your father," explained the employee, handing over a piece of paper with Margaret's phone number. Michael felt his heart race. He rarely received urgent messages, and when he did, it usually meant something was wrong with Margaret's health or Emma's. The mention of father confused him, because Margaret knew he didn't like talking about Robert. "Thank you," said Michael, taking the paper and heading to a payphone in the terminal. Robert, who had witnessed the scene from a distance, felt a tightness in his chest. He knew it wasn't a coincidence that Michael had received a message about the father on the very day he was in Memphis. Something important was happening, and he had a feeling his life was about to change too. Michael dialed the home number with slightly trembling hands. Margaret answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Mom, I got your message. What's going on?" he asked, trying to stay calm. "Michael, sweetheart, you need to sit down because I have something very important to tell you," said Margaret, taking a deep breath. "Emma found some papers here at home, and now I need to tell you the truth about your father." "What papers? What truth?" asked Michael, his anxiety growing. "Robert isn't your biological father, Michael," said Margaret, her voice breaking. "Your real father was named William James Wilson, and he died before you were born." Michael's world collapsed in seconds. He leaned against the wall near the phone, his legs weak and his head spinning. Every certainty he'd built about his own identity suddenly felt false. "What do you mean he's not my father?" he managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "William James was a military pilot, Michael. You have the same eyes, the same way of walking, the same passion for flying," Margaret explained, crying on the other end of the line. "He died in a plane crash 3 months before you were born." Michael felt a mix of shock, anger, and a strange sense of relief. Suddenly, so many things made sense. His natural ease with flying, his inexplicable love for the skies, even some physical traits he'd never been able to explain. "What about Robert?" he asked, trying to process everything. "Robert was William James's friend. He helped me when you were born and married me to give you a family," Margaret explained. "He loved you like his own son, Michael. He never treated you any differently than Jennifer." "But then why did he leave? Why did you always say he abandoned us?" Michael questioned, feeling anger rise in his chest. Margaret took a deep breath before continuing. She knew the next part of the confession would be the hardest. "Because I lied, son. I made up that story because I was afraid you'd find out the truth about William James and think I'd betrayed his memory," she admitted, sobbing. "Robert never abandoned you when you were little. He left because you rejected him, believing the lie I created." Michael had to sit in a nearby chair. The revelation that he'd spent 20 years hating an innocent man was devastating. Every time he'd spoken badly of Robert, every moment he'd felt anger toward the father who abandoned him, now seemed cruel and unfair. "Mom, where is Robert now?" Michael asked, his voice shaking. "He's there in Memphis, son. He's been working at the airport as a mechanic for 15 years, Margaret replied. "Emma found a letter he sent a few years ago." Michael looked around the terminal and suddenly understood why he had received that message right there. Margaret and Emma knew he would run into Robert if he wasn't told the truth first. "Does he know I'm here?" Michael asked. "I don't know, son, but if he works at the airport, he probably saw you arrive," Margaret replied. "Michael, you need to know he never stopped thinking about you and Jennifer. In the letters Emma found, he always asked about you both." Michael hung up the phone in shock and stood frozen in the terminal for several minutes, trying to gather his thoughts. His entire life had been built on a lie, and now he had to decide what to do with this information. The first thing he felt was deep anger toward Margaret for keeping the truth hidden for so long. But soon after came guilt for how cruelly he had treated Robert during his teenage years. The man who had raised him with love was just a few feet away, and Michael didn't know if he had the courage to face him. He decided to leave the terminal and find Robert before he lost his nerve. He walked toward the hangars where he knew the aircraft maintenance shops were. His heart pounded so loudly he could hear his own heartbeat. Robert was putting away his tools when he saw Michael approaching. All those years, he had imagined this moment, but he could never have predicted the emotions he would feel. Seeing the grown man his son had become, Robert felt pride, sadness, and cautious hope. "Robert?" Michael called when he was about 5 yards away. "Michael," Robert answered, turning slowly. "You've grown so much." The two men stared at each other in silence for a few seconds. Michael studied Robert's face, searching for signs of the years that had passed. The man was thinner and had much more grey hair, but his eyes still held the same kindness Michael remembered from childhood. I just found out the truth," Michael said, his voice unsteady. "About William James, about you, about everything." Robert nodded sadly. He had spent years preparing for this moment, yet he still didn't know exactly what to say. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," Robert said. "I wanted to tell you myself, but I never knew how." "Why didn't you ever try to find me?" Michael asked, feeling tears well up in his eyes. "I tried a few times, but I always lost my nerve," Robert admitted. "I knew you hated me for abandoning the family. I never imagined your mother had made up that story." "I don't hate you," Michael said, surprising himself with the sincerity of his words. "I hate the lie. I hate losing 20 years believing something that wasn't true." Robert took a step toward Michael, but stopped when he saw the younger man instinctively pull back. "I'll understand if you want nothing to do with me," Robert said, his voice thick. "But I want you to know I never stopped loving you like a son. Neither you nor Jennifer." "Jennifer," Michael murmured, remembering his sister. "She died without knowing the truth." "I heard about the accident," Robert said, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "I wanted to go to the funeral, but I didn't know if I'd be welcome." Michael felt another wave of anger, this time directed at Margaret. His mother had robbed Robert of the chance to say goodbye to Jennifer, a daughter he had raised since she was a baby. The scale of the injustice was becoming clearer and clearer. "You should have been there," Michael said firmly. "Jennifer loved you. She always defended you, even after you left." The words hit Robert like a physical blow. Knowing that Jennifer had kept positive feelings for him, even believing he had abandoned the family, was both comforting and devastating. "Did she ever ask about me?" Robert asked, his voice almost inaudible. "Always," Michael replied, beginning to understand just how much Robert had suffered all those years. "She said you were a good father no matter what had happened." Robert leaned against a nearby counter, his legs feeling weak. For 2 decades, he had carried the guilt of abandoning his children, unaware that he had actually been the victim of a much more complex situation. "Michael, I want you to know that leaving home was the hardest thing I've ever done," Robert said, looking directly into the eyes of the man he had raised. "But I couldn't stay in a house where my own son treated me like a stranger." "I was a stupid teenager," Michael said, weighed down by guilt. "I didn't understand anything about life, about family, about what you'd done for us." "You were a child trying to figure out your own identity," Robert corrected, with the generosity that had always defined him. "It was never your fault, Michael." The two men fell silent for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Michael was trying to reprocess 20 years of memories from a new perspective, while Robert fought against the hope that maybe they could still rebuild some kind of relationship. "Tell me about William James," Michael asked, sitting in a nearby chair. "I want to know everything about my biological father." For the first time since the conversation had begun, Robert smiled. All those years, he had held on to precious memories of William James, never having the chance to share them with Michael. "He was my best friend since childhood," Robert began, leaning against the counter. "We grew up on the same street, played together, got into every kind of mischief imaginable. When he decided to join the military, I was heartbroken, because I knew I'd be separated from my brother in spirit." "Did he always want to be a pilot?" Michael asked, hungry for details about the father he'd never known. Since he was little, Robert replied, his eyes shining at the memory. He made paper airplanes that flew better than any other kids on the block. When he got older, he built wooden model planes that actually worked. His room was full of airplane sketches and photos of famous pilots. Michael felt a shiver. As a child, he too had obsessively made paper airplanes, always trying to create models that flew farther and more steadily. He'd never connected that obsession to any genetic inheritance. Was he a good pilot? Michael asked. Exceptional, Robert answered with genuine pride. His instructors said he had a natural talent. It was like he was born to fly. When he got into a plane, it was as if he became a different person, more confident, more complete. The similarities between father and son were undeniable. Michael also felt like a different person when he was flying, more self-assured and in perfect harmony with the world around him. Had he been dating my mom for long? Michael asked. 2 years, Robert replied. They met at a party, and it was love at first sight. William James talked about Margaret constantly, about their plans together, how he wanted to build a family with her. Why did you marry my mom after he died? Michael asked, trying to understand the family dynamic that had shaped his upbringing. Robert hesitated before answering. It was a complex question, involving deep feelings and decisions made in moments of great emotional pain. Because I loved William James like a brother, and I wanted to take care of the people he loved, said Robert finally. Your mother was devastated, pregnant and alone. You were my best friend's son. It felt natural to take on the responsibility he couldn't fulfill. But did you love my mother? Insisted Michael. I learned to love her, answered Robert honestly. At first it was just affection and a sense of duty, but over time we developed a genuine relationship. It wasn't the same passion she had felt for William James, but it was real and solid. Michael was beginning to understand the complexity of the situation that had shaped his family. Margaret had married the best friend of the man she loved. Trying to rebuild a life shattered by tragedy, Robert had taken on responsibilities that weren't his out of love and loyalty. And when I started treating you badly as a teenager, how did you feel? Asked Michael. Broken, Robert replied without hesitation. I'd raised you since you were a baby, taught you to walk, to ride a bike, helped you with your homework. To me, you were my son in every way. When you started rejecting me, it felt like my heart was breaking every day. Robert's brutal honesty made Michael feel even worse. He had deeply hurt a man who had never done him any harm, driven by false information and the confusion of adolescence. Why did my mother make up that story? Asked Michael. She was afraid, Robert explained. Afraid you'd find out about William James and feel she had betrayed his memory by marrying me. Afraid you'd reject her for replacing your biological father. But the lie was so much worse than the truth would have been, Michael observed. Yes, it was, Robert agreed. But people sometimes make bad decisions when they're scared. Your mother always wanted to protect you, even if her methods were questionable. Michael fell silent for a few minutes, processing everything he'd just learned. His entire life had been built on a distorted version of reality, and now he had to decide how to handle this new truth. Robert, I want to apologize, Michael said, finally looking directly into the eyes of the man who had raised him, for treating you badly, for believing the lies, for pushing you out of our family. You don't have to apologize for anything, Robert replied, tears in his eyes. You were just a confused kid, trying to figure out your own identity. It was never your fault. I wasted 20 years, Michael said, feeling the weight of lost time. 20 years I could have spent getting to know you better, learning more about William James, keeping our family together. 20 years isn't a whole lifetime, Robert said with a cautious smile. If you want, we can still make up for some of that time. Michael looked at Robert and saw not just the man who had raised him, but also the last living connection to William James. Through Robert, he could learn more about his biological father and understand where his own talents and traits came from. I'd like that, Michael said, feeling a mix of hope and nervousness. But I don't know where. To start, there's so much hurt and misunderstanding between us. We start slow, Robert suggested. Maybe you could come over for dinner tonight. I live alone, but I still know how to make that beef stroganoff you loved as a kid. The mention of his childhood favorite meal made Michael smile for the first time since he'd arrived at the airport. Robert had remembered a seemingly insignificant detail, but one that showed how closely he'd paid attention to the likes and preferences of the boy he'd raised. "I remember that stroganoff," said Michael, feeling a wave of nostalgia. "You always made it on Sundays, and I'd have 2 helpings because I said I was growing." "And you were," replied Robert, laughing. "You grew so much that now I have to look up to talk to you." The remark eased some of the tension still lingering between them. Michael realized that despite all the years that had passed, Robert's warm and good-humored personality remained the same. "But I need to cancel my meeting," Michael said, suddenly remembering his commitment. "I came to Memphis for work." "You don't have to cancel on my account," Robert said quickly. "We can have dinner after you finish your business. I'm not going anywhere." Michael was touched by Robert's thoughtfulness. Even after 20 years apart, the man still cared not to disrupt his professional life. "Actually, I want to cancel," Michael said. "There are things more important than work, and I've already wasted too much time." Robert smiled, but made sure to clarify that Michael shouldn't jeopardize his career over their reunion. "At least call to let them know you'll reschedule," Robert suggested. "It's not professional to leave people waiting without notice." Michael agreed and stepped away to call the cooperative, explaining that a family emergency had come up and he'd need to reschedule the meeting for the next day. The clients were understanding, especially when he explained he could stay longer in town to give the matter proper attention. When he returned from the call, Michael found Robert organizing his tools and preparing to wrap up for the day. It was almost noon, and though Robert usually worked until 5 in the afternoon, his supervisor had allowed him to leave early upon hearing the situation. "Would you like to see my house?" Robert asked with a shyness Michael found touching. "Of course," Michael replied. "But first, I'd like to see some pictures of William James if you have any." "I have plenty," Robert said, his eyes brightening. "I kept everything he left me when he passed. Photos, letters, even the notebook where he jotted down flying techniques." The mention of the flying notebook made Michael's heart race. The idea that he might have access to his biological father's thoughts and knowledge was both thrilling and daunting. The 2 men walked together through the airport toward the parking lot, where Robert had left his pickup truck. Along the way, Robert pointed out different aircraft and explained technical details about each one, displaying a deep understanding of aviation he'd gained over the years. "William James taught me so much about planes," Robert explained. "He said every man in the family should at least know the basics of flying to appreciate the beauty of aviation." "Family," Michael repeated, testing how the word sounded. "I never thought of William James as part of my family because I didn't know he existed." "Now you do," Robert said, stopping near the truck, "and you can start learning about your real family heritage." On the way to Robert's house, Michael observed Memphis with new eyes. He knew this wasn't just another work trip, but a moment of redefining his own identity. He was about to discover parts of himself he'd ignored his whole life. Robert's house was simple but well kept, located in a middle-class neighborhood in the northern part of the city. It had 2 bedrooms, a small living room, a kitchen, and a backyard where Robert tended a garden of vegetables and herbs. "It's small, but it's mine," said Robert, opening the front door. "I bought it 10 years ago when I finally saved enough for a down payment." Michael stepped inside and immediately noticed the walls were decorated with old photos, some of which showed people he didn't recognize. Robert noticed his interest and stepped closer to explain. "That's your paternal grandmother," said Robert, pointing to a photo of an elderly woman smiling. "Mrs. Martha, William James's mother. She passed 8 years ago, but she always asked about you." "She knew I existed?" asked Michael, surprised. "She knew, and really wanted to meet you," Robert replied. "I visited her now and then, and told her how you were growing up. She always said you looked just like William James when he was a boy." Michael felt a pang of sadness, knowing he'd missed the chance to meet his paternal grandmother. Another consequence of the lies that had kept his family apart for so long. "And this one?" Michael asked, pointing to a photo of a young man in a military uniform. "That's your father," said Robert, his voice emotional. "William James at 22, when he finished his military pilot training." Michael took the photo with trembling hands. It was the first time he'd seen an image of his biological father, and the physical resemblance was striking. William James had the same green eyes, the same facial structure, even the same confident expression Michael recognized in his own photos. "It's like looking in a mirror," Michael murmured, studying every detail of the image. "Your mother always said that," Robert confirmed. "You inherited nearly everything from him, physically speaking. Your personalities also have surprising similarities." "How so?" Michael asked, curious. William James was determined, a perfectionist, and had a tendency to withdraw when he was worried about something, Robert explained. He was also fiercely loyal to the people he loved, but took a while to trust strangers. Michael was struck by how accurate the description was. All those traits were part of his own personality, and he'd always thought they were uniquely his. "Come, I want to show you something," said Robert, leading Michael to one of the bedrooms. The room was small and simple, but one entire wall was covered with shelves holding books, documents, and personal items. Robert explained he'd turned the space into a kind of memorial dedicated to William James and the family memories they'd shared. "These are your father's flight logs," said Robert, pulling 3 bound notebooks from a shelf. "He wrote down everything: flight techniques, observations on different aircraft, even personal thoughts about what it meant to be a pilot." Michael took one of the notebooks and opened it to a random page. The handwriting was neat and organized, the content showing impressive technical knowledge about aviation. But what caught his attention most were the personal notes scattered among the technical details. "Flying isn't just a profession, it's a form of meditation. When I'm in the cockpit, I feel closest to who I really am." Read one entry. Michael shivered. He'd had nearly identical thoughts during his own flights without ever hearing or reading anything like it from others. "Can I borrow these?" Michael asked. "You can keep them," Robert replied, smiling. William James wrote these notes thinking of the son he'd have one day. Now they can finally reach the right person. Michael clutched the notebooks to his chest, feeling a deep emotional connection to the father he had never known. Through those pages, he might finally come to understand William James's thoughts and feelings. "Robert, can I ask you a difficult question?" Michael said after a few minutes of flipping through the notebooks. "Of course," Robert replied, sitting down on the bed in the room. "Do you ever regret taking responsibility for raising me?" Michael asked. "I mean, you were young, single, you could have had a completely different life." Robert fell silent for a moment, carefully considering his answer. "I never regretted raising you," he finally said. "You and Jennifer were the best things that ever happened to me. The only thing I regret is not being able to keep our family together." "It wasn't your fault." Michael echoed the words Robert had once said to him. "You did the best you could in a very difficult situation." "Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I had told you the truth when you started asking questions about your father," Robert reflected. "Maybe things would have been different. Or maybe I wouldn't have been mature enough to handle such complex information," Michael replied. "Teenagers aren't exactly known for their emotional wisdom." They both laughed, easing some of the heaviness in the room. Michael was starting to feel more comfortable in Robert's presence, rediscovering the ease of communication they had shared when he was a child. "Tell me about your life these past 20 years, Michael asked. "I want to know how you got here." Robert began recounting the years he spent trying to rebuild his life after leaving home. At first, he had lived in cheap boarding houses and taken odd jobs, struggling with depression and feelings of rejection. Gradually, he found professional and emotional stability, but he had never managed to form lasting romantic relationships. "I always compared women to your mother," Robert admitted. "I know our relationship wasn't perfect, but she was the great love of my life. I never fell in love like that again." "You never tried to start a new family?" Michael asked. "I tried a few times, but it never worked out," Robert replied. "I think part of me always hoped that one day you'd both come back into my life." The confession moved Michael deeply. Knowing Robert had spent 2 decades holding on to hope for a family reconciliation made him feel even guiltier for taking so long to uncover the truth. "What about you?" Robert asked. "Never married? Never had children?" "I've had some serious relationships, But nothing led to marriage, Michael answered. I think I was always afraid of repeating the family patterns I knew, afraid of abandoning someone the way I thought you had abandoned us. It's ironic, Robert observed. You avoided lasting relationships because you were afraid of being like me, but the truth is, I never willingly left you. That's why the truth is so important, Michael said. Lies create distorted realities that affect every decision we make. The two men continued talking all afternoon, filling in the gaps of the 20 years they had spent apart. Robert spoke about his work at the airport, the friends he had made, and the struggles and joys of living alone. Michael, in turn, shared about his career as a pilot and sales representative, the pain of losing Jennifer, and the responsibility of caring for Emma and Grandma Margaret. He also admitted that he had always felt an inexplicable emptiness in his life, as if he were missing an important part of his own identity. Now I understand where that feeling came from, said Michael. It was the absence of the truth about my origins, about who I really am. And about William James, added Robert. You always carried a part of him inside you, but you never knew where those traits came from. As the sun began to set, Robert got up to prepare the promised dinner. Michael offered to help, and the two worked together in the kitchen, rediscovering a domestic harmony that had been lost for a long time. Do you still remember the stroganoff recipe? Asked Michael, slicing the meat into thin strips. I never forgot, replied Robert, smiling. I've cooked this dish hundreds of times over the years, always remembering how happy you were when I made it. It felt like a special moment, said Michael. Sunday afternoons, the whole family gathered around the table, you and my mother, talking about the week, Jennifer sharing the latest school gossip. Those were good times, agreed Robert, stirring the sauce in the pan. Despite all the problems we faced later, those years when you were little were the best of my life. As they cooked, Michael began to recall childhood memories he had suppressed for years. He remembered Robert teaching him to ride a bike, helping him with math homework, taking him to play soccer in the park on Saturdays. You were a good father, Michael said suddenly. Even though you weren't my biological father, you were a good one. Robert stopped stirring the sauce and looked at Michael with tears in his eyes. Thank you for saying that, Robert said, his voice choked. That's all I ever wanted to hear. Dinner was an emotionally intense experience for both of them. The stroganoff tasted exactly as Michael remembered, and sharing that familiar meal with Robert brought back a sense of security and belonging he hadn't felt in decades. What do we do now? Michael asked when they finished eating. Now, we take it one step at a time, Robert replied. We don't have to figure everything out at once. The important thing is that we're talking again. I want you to get to know Emma better, said Michael. She's the one who uncovered all of this. If it weren't for her, we might never have found each other again. How is she handling all of this? Robert asked, concerned. Better than the adults, Michael admitted, laughing. Kids sometimes have an amazing ability to accept changes that scare us. I'd really like to meet her, said Robert. I've always wondered what Jennifer's daughter would be like. She's smart, determined, and has incredible intuition, Michael described. A lot like her mother, but with an emotional strength Jennifer sometimes lacked. And how does she feel about you? Robert asked. We're very close, Michael replied. Since Jennifer passed, I've become her father figure. It's not an easy responsibility, but it's very rewarding. I can imagine, said Robert. Raising a child alone takes a lot of effort and dedication. That's when I realize how much you must have struggled to take care of me and Jennifer, Michael said. Now that I'm going through the same experience, I understand the sacrifice it takes. Their conversation was interrupted by the ringing of the phone. Robert answered and handed it to Michael, explaining it was a call from Riverside. Uncle Michael, came Emma's voice on the other end. Hi, sweetheart. How did you get this number? Michael asked. Grandma Margaret found it in the phone book, Emma explained. Have you two met yet? Yes, we're here talking, replied Michael, looking at Robert. Do you want to speak with him? There was silence on the other end of the line, and Michael realized Emma was nervous about talking to the man who had been her mother's stepfather. Does he want to talk to me? Asked Emma in a small voice. Michael glanced at Robert, who nodded vigorously. Of course he does, said Michael. Let me pass the phone to him. "Emma," said Robert, taking the phone with trembling hands. "It's me, Robert." "Hi," Emma replied shyly. "Are you mad at me for going through Grandma's things?" "Mad?" repeated Robert, surprised. "Sweetheart, I'm grateful. If you hadn't uncovered the truth, I might never have had the chance to talk to your uncle again." "Really?" Emma asked, clearly relieved. "Really," Robert confirmed. "You were very brave to investigate the family history, and even braver to decide to tell the truth, knowing it might cause trouble." "I just thought everyone deserved to know," Emma explained. "It's not fair to live based on lies." "You're absolutely right," Robert said, smiling, "and I'd really like to meet you in person. It's been so long since I've seen you." "I want to meet you too," said Emma. "My mum always spoke well of you, even after you left." The mention of Jennifer made Robert emotional again. Knowing that the daughter he had raised still held a positive image of him was both comforting and painful. "Your mother was a special girl," Robert said. "I'm sure you take after her." "Uncle Michael says I do," Emma replied. "Robert, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. Are you coming back to Riverside?" Emma asked, hope barely hidden in her voice. Robert looked at Michael, searching for guidance. Michael nodded encouragingly. "I don't know yet," Robert answered honestly. "I need to talk more with your uncle and your grandmother before making that kind of decision." "But do you want to?" Emma pressed. "I really do," Robert admitted. "But sometimes what we want isn't possible, and I don't want to give false hope." "Grandma Margaret wants to talk to you," Emma said suddenly. "She's here next to me, crying." Robert's heart raced. He hadn't spoken to Margaret in 20 years and wasn't sure he was emotionally ready for this conversation. "Put her on," Robert said, taking a deep breath. "Robert?" came Margaret's shaky voice. "Margaret," Robert replied, a mix of nerves and nostalgia washing over him. "I need to apologize," Margaret said between sobs. "I ruined everything. I made up those lies and tore our family apart." "Margaret, don't cry," Robert said, instinctively slipping into the comforting role he'd always played in their relationship. "What matters is that the truth is out now." "Can you forgive me?" Margaret asked. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need to know if you can." Robert closed his eyes, thinking of all the years of hurt, loneliness, and longing he'd endured. But he also thought of the woman he'd loved and the family they'd built, however briefly. "I forgave you a long time ago," Robert said, surprising himself with the sincerity of his words. "Holding on to bitterness was only hurting me." "Thank you," Margaret whispered. "You've always been a better man than I deserved." "Don't say that," Robert gently scolded. "We all make mistakes when we're scared or confused. What matters is having the courage to make things right." "Would you come home?" Margaret asked, echoing Emma's question from moments before. "I don't know if that's a good idea," Robert answered carefully. "A lot of time has passed. Many things have changed. But you're still family," insisted Margaret. "You've always been family, even during all these years apart." Robert looked at Michael, who was following the conversation with interest and apprehension. It was obvious that Robert's return to Riverside would be a decision affecting the entire family, and he didn't want to make a hasty choice. "Let's talk about this calmly," said Robert. "First, I need to sort things out properly with Michael. Then we'll see what's possible." "All right," said Margaret, "but know that you have a home here if you want to come back." After they hung up, Robert and Michael sat in silence for a few minutes, each processing the conversation that had just taken place. "What do you think?" asked Robert finally. "I think your family misses you deeply," replied Michael, "but I also think you should make a decision based on what's best for you, not just what others want." "It's a very difficult decision," admitted Robert. "For 20 years I dreamed of the possibility of returning, but now that it's becoming real, I'm afraid it might not work out." "Why wouldn't it?" asked Michael. "Because maybe it's too late," said Robert. "Maybe the time that's passed has changed all of us in ways we can't undo. Or maybe that time has taught us to value what truly matters," suggested Michael. "I know it's taught me." "How do you feel about the possibility of me coming back?" asked Robert, looking Michael directly in the eyes. "I feel it would be a chance to finally have the family we always deserved," replied Michael without hesitation. "A family built on truth, not lies." "And do you really think we could overcome all the problems from the past?" asked Robert. "I don't know if we could overcome everything," admitted Michael. "But I know we'd try, and that would already be so much more than we've had these past 20 years. Robert stood up and walked to the living room window, looking out at the backyard where he tended his small garden. For 2 decades, that house had been his refuge, the place where he felt safe and shielded from the outside world. The idea of leaving it all behind and starting over in Riverside was both appealing and terrifying. "I have a suggestion," said Michael, joining Robert at the window. "Why don't you spend a weekend in Riverside? That way you can see how it feels to be there again, and we can all get used to the idea of being a family once more." "That's a sensible idea," agreed Robert. "Not making a final decision right away, but testing the waters." "Exactly," said Michael. "And if it doesn't work out, you can always come back here, no bridges burned." "Do you think Emma would be happy to get to know me better?" asked Robert, with touching uncertainty. "I'm sure of it," replied Michael. "She's a very open and affectionate girl. Besides, she's the one who uncovered this whole story and insisted I come find you." "And Margaret?" asked Robert. "Do you think she really wants me back? Or is she just feeling guilty?" "I think she does feel guilty," admitted Michael. "But I also think the guilt comes from genuinely missing you. If she didn't care, she wouldn't feel so bad about lying." Robert nodded, considering Michael's words. He knew Margaret well, enough to understand she wouldn't show regret if there weren't real feelings involved. "All right," said Robert finally. "I'll spend a weekend in Riverside. But only as a visitor, with no commitment to stay permanently." "Perfect," said Michael, smiling. "How about next weekend?" "So we have a week to prepare everyone emotionally." "Deal," agreed Robert. "But now tell me more about William James. I want to know everything you found out about him today." The 2 men spent the rest of the night talking about William James, flipping through old photos and reading excerpts from the flight logs. Michael was fascinated to discover that his biological father had dreamed of opening an aviation school after retiring from the military, and had detailed plans for teaching flight techniques to civilians. "It's amazing how alike you think," Robert remarked when Michael mentioned he had also considered teaching flight lessons. "William James always said flying was knowledge meant to be shared, not kept to yourself." "I feel the same." "Wait," Michael said. "Sometimes when I'm flying alone, I think about how rewarding it would be to teach others how to experience that sense of freedom." "Maybe it's time to seriously consider that possibility," Robert suggested. "It would be a way to honor your father's memory." "Maybe," Michael agreed, "but first I need to sort out my personal life." When it was time for Michael to leave, the 2 men said goodbye with a hesitant but genuine hug. There was still some tension between them, the result of years of separation and misunderstandings, but there was also a solid foundation of mutual affection that had stood the test of time. "Thank you for giving me a second chance," Robert said as he walked Michael to the car. "Thank you for waiting for it," Michael replied. "Most people would have given up long ago." "It was never an option," Robert said simply. "Family isn't something you give up on easily." Michael drove back to the hotel where he had decided to spend the night instead of flying back to Riverside in the dark. During the drive, he reflected on everything he had discovered and experienced that extraordinary day. In less than 12 hours, his understanding of his own identity had completely changed. He had learned that the father he hated wasn't actually his father, that his biological father had been a military pilot who died before his birth, and that his passion for flying was a genetic inheritance, not just a coincidence. But more important than the revelations about the past was the possibility of rebuilding relationships in the present. Robert was willing to forgive years of rejection and try again to be part of the family. Margaret had finally found the courage to confess her lies. And Emma had shown surprising wisdom by insisting that the truth was always better than lies. When he got to the hotel, Michael called home to share the day's news. Emma answered immediately, as if she had been waiting by the phone. "So, Uncle, how did it go?" the girl asked eagerly. "It was intense," Michael replied, searching for words to describe the experience. "I learned a lot about myself and our family." "Is Robert nice?" Emma asked. "Very nice," Michael confirmed. "He's coming to spend a weekend with us next week." "Really? Emma exclaimed, clearly excited. "Grandma's going to be so happy. And you? How are you feeling about all this?" Michael asked, concerned about the emotional impact these revelations might be having on the girl. "I'm happy," Emma answered simply. "Finally, our family will be whole again." Emma's simplicity and optimism touched Michael deeply. The girl had managed to see through all the emotional complexity of the situation and recognize what truly mattered: the chance to bring loved ones back together. "Pass the phone to Grandma," Michael asked. "Michael," Margaret said, her voice still trembling from the day's emotions. "Mom, we talked a lot today," said Michael. "Robert told me the whole story from his perspective." "And are you very angry with me?" asked Margaret, afraid of the answer. "I'm disappointed," Michael admitted, "but I'm also trying to understand why you did what you did. And Robert helped me see that you were trying to protect us, even if it was the wrong way." "I'm so sorry, son," said Margaret, crying. "I never meant to cause so much pain." "I know, Mom," Michael said, his voice softening. "And now we have a chance to fix the mistakes of the past. Robert is coming to spend a weekend with us." "How is he?" asked Margaret. "Is he okay?" "He's fine," Michael replied. "Older, grayer, but still the same kind man who raised us. Thank you for going after him," Margaret said. "I know it wasn't easy for you." "Actually, it was easier than I expected," Michael said. "Some connections are just too strong to break, even after all this time." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. After hanging up the phone, Michael lay on his hotel bed and picked up one of the flight manuals Robert had given him. He flipped through the pages slowly, studying each of William James's notes, trying to better understand the man who had given him life. One note in particular caught his attention. A true pilot isn't the one who masters the machine, but the one who understands that man and aircraft must work in harmony. Flying is a dance between control and surrender, between planning and intuition. Michael smiled, recognizing in his own thoughts about flying echoes of words written decades before he was born. It was as if William James had passed down not just physical traits, but an aviation philosophy that lived on through his son. Another note that moved him read, "I hope one day to teach my son to fly. Not just the techniques, but the love for the freedom only the skies can offer. I want him to understand that flying is more than moving through the air. It's touching the infinite." Reading those words made Michael feel connected to William James in a way he'd never experienced with anyone else. It was as if his biological father had left a message just for him, bridging decades of separation. He spent hours with the notebooks, discovering technical aspects of aviation William James had mastered, knowledge that could still be useful in his own flights. But he also found personal reflections on responsibility, family, and the dreams William James had held for the future. On one of the last pages, William James had written, "If something happens to me before I meet my son, I hope someone tells him I loved him even before he was born. I hope he understands that even if I'm not there, my love for him will cross any distance or obstacle." Michael closed the notebook and cried for the first time since arriving in Memphis. These weren't tears of sadness, but of a deep, complex emotion: grief for the father he'd never known, gratitude for finally learning his story, and hope that he could honor William James's memory through his own life choices. The next morning, Michael canceled his work meeting for good and decided to spend another day in Memphis, talking with Robert and getting to know the city where the man who raised him had built a new life. He met Robert at the airport, where he was finishing repairs on a small plane. Michael was impressed by Robert's technical skills and the deep knowledge he displayed about aircraft systems. "Did William James teach you about mechanics too?" Michael asked, watching Robert work. "A little," Robert replied, adjusting a part of the engine. "He said every pilot should at least understand the basics of how the planes they fly work." "That makes sense," Michael agreed. "I know the basics too, but nothing compared to what you know." "After he passed, I started studying mechanics on my own," Robert explained. "It was a way to feel close to him, to keep learning the things he had planned to teach me, and it ended up becoming your profession," Michael observed. "Yes," Robert said, smiling. Sometimes tragedies lead us down paths we never imagined, but that end up being right for us. Michael helped Robert finish the repair, and afterward, the two walked around the airport while Robert explained details about the different aircraft that regularly parked there. It was obvious he knew all the local pilots and had become a respected figure in the regional aviation community. "Have you ever thought about going back to Riverside and working at the airport there?" Michael asked. "I have," Robert admitted. "But after so much time, I'm afraid of starting over from scratch." "You wouldn't be starting from scratch," Michael said. "You'd be going home." Robert stopped walking and looked at Michael thoughtfully. "Do you really think Riverside is still my home?" he asked. "I think home is where your family is," Michael replied. "And your family is in Riverside, waiting for you to come back." "What if it doesn't work out? What if we realize we've changed too much and can't live together anymore?" Robert asked, voicing his deepest fears. "Then at least we'll have tried," Michael said. "And that's better than spending the rest of our lives wondering what if." The two had lunch together at a small diner near the airport, where Robert was known by the staff as a regular and beloved customer. Michael noticed how easily Robert interacted with people, showing the same kindness and good humor that had defined his personality when they lived together. Over lunch, Robert shared more stories about William James, filling in gaps in Michael's understanding of his biological father. He described how William James was charismatic and funny, but also responsible and mature beyond his years. He had a theory about family, Robert said, cutting the meat on his plate. He said family isn't just about blood, it's about choice. That people become family when they choose to care for each other, regardless of biological ties. "That's an interesting theory," Michael said, "and one that perfectly applies to what you did for me and Jennifer. William James would have been very proud of the man you've become," Robert said, looking directly into Michael's eyes. "And I'm proud too, I always have been." "Even when I treated you badly as a teenager?" Michael asked. "Especially then," Robert replied, "because I knew you were struggling to understand your own identity and that you'd eventually find your way." "You had more faith in me than I had in myself," Michael observed. "That's what parents do," Robert said simply. "They believe in their children even when the children don't believe in themselves." After lunch, Robert took Michael to see the house where William James had lived with his parents before joining the military. The house had been sold years ago, but it was still standing, and Robert explained that many important memories were tied to that place. "It was in this house that William James showed me his first pilot's logbook," said Robert, pointing to a second-floor window. "That was his room, and he would spend hours there, studying aviation manuals and taking notes." "Can I see the room?" asked Michael, driven by intense curiosity. Robert spoke with the current residents of the house, who agreed to let Michael quickly see William James's old room. The space looked completely different now, but Michael could still picture his father as a young man there, dreaming of flights and planning his future. "He would stay up late studying," Robert shared. "Sometimes I'd come visit and find him surrounded by books, completely absorbed in aviation readings." "I do the same thing," said Michael, surprised. "Whenever I find new material about flying, I spend hours reading and taking notes." "The passion for knowledge was inherited," Robert observed with a smile. They spent the rest of the afternoon visiting places that had been important to William James. The school he attended, the park where he played as a child, even the store where he bought his first aviation books. Each place brought new stories and details about William James's personality, and Michael gradually formed a clearer picture of the man who had given him life. He learned that William James was known for his generosity, determination, and ability to make friends easily. "Was he a lot like me?" Michael asked as they headed back to Robert's house. "In many ways, yes," Robert replied, "but there were differences too. William James was more outgoing than you, more impulsive. You inherited his intelligence and determination, but you have a caution he didn't." "Where did the caution come from?" Michael asked. "From your mother," Robert said, laughing. "Margaret was always more thoughtful, more concerned about risks. You got a bit of both." "It's an interesting mix," Michael remarked. "It's a mix that worked out well," Robert said. "You have William James's passion and talent, but also Margaret's practical wisdom." When they arrived at Robert's house, Michael announced he'd made an important decision. I want you to come back to Riverside with me tomorrow, Michael said. Not permanently, just for the visit we planned. But I want you to come tomorrow, not next weekend. Why the rush? Robert asked, surprised. Because we've already lost too much time, Michael replied. And because Emma is eager to meet you. I saw it in her eyes yesterday. She really wants a complete family. And do you think Margaret is ready to see me tomorrow? Robert asked. I think she's more ready now than she'll be if she has a whole week to get nervous, Michael said. Sometimes it's better to act on impulse than to overplan. Robert considered the idea for a few minutes. The thought of returning to Riverside after 20 years was daunting, but also thrilling. And Michael was right. The more time he had to think, the more anxious he'd become. All right, Robert said finally, but just for a few days, and if things get uncomfortable for anyone, I'll come right back here. Deal, Michael said, but I'm sure it won't be necessary. They spent the evening packing some of Robert's clothes and talking about the upcoming reunion with Margaret and the first meeting with Emma. Robert was visibly nervous, but there was also a hopeful excitement he hadn't felt in years. What should I say to Emma when I meet her? Robert asked. She's Jennifer's daughter, but I haven't seen her since she was a baby. Just be yourself, Michael advised. Emma is very smart and can tell when people are being fake. If you're genuine, she'll like you. And if she asks me why I left, asked Robert. Tell her the truth, said Michael. In a way that's appropriate for her age, but tell the truth. She already knows there were lies in the family and she'll respect your honesty. The next morning, Robert asked for a few days off work and prepared for the trip that would change his life once again. As he was packing, he found an old photo of the whole family together, taken just a few years before he left home. In the picture, Michael was about 15 and Jennifer was 12. Margaret was smiling, but already showing signs of the weariness their family situation had caused. Robert, then 40, looked happy, but already carried the tension that had been growing at home. We were a beautiful family, Robert said, showing the photo to Michael. We still are, Michael replied, just older and hopefully wiser. The flight back to Riverside was emotionally intense for both of them. Michael piloted while Robert watched the familiar landscape draw closer, remembering the years when that had been his home. As they neared the airport, Robert could see the town where he had lived the best years of his life. It's the same, Robert remarked as they flew over downtown Riverside. Some things have changed, but the heart of it is still the same, Michael said. Just like our family. When they landed, Michael saw Margaret and Emma waiting near the terminal. The two women were visibly nervous but also eager. Emma held her grandmother's hand and stared intently at the plane, trying to spot Robert. They're over there, Michael said, pointing toward the two women. Robert took a deep breath and prepared for the moment he had imagined thousands of times over the past 20 years. As he stepped off the plane, he could see Margaret clearly and noticed how much she had aged. But he also saw that she still had the same shy smile that had won him over decades ago. Emma was the first to approach. The girl walked toward Robert with surprising confidence for her age, showing no hesitation. Are you Robert? Emma asked, looking straight into his eyes. I am, Robert replied, kneeling to meet her at eye level. And you're Emma? I am, Emma said, smiling. You're taller than I imagined. And you're even prettier than I expected, Robert answered, returning her smile. I remember you when you were a baby, Robert said. You had the same green eyes you have now. My mum said I got them from Grandpa William James, Emma replied, showing she had already absorbed the revelations about the family's past. That's true, Robert confirmed. You have your grandfather's eyes and your mother's smile. Margaret approached hesitantly, unsure how to greet the man who had once been her husband and whom she hadn't seen in 20 years. Robert stood up and faced her, equally uncertain about the right way to acknowledge her. Margaret, Robert said simply. Robert, she answered, her voice trembling. You look... well, so do you, Robert said, noticing that, despite the signs of age, Margaret was still a beautiful and elegant woman. The two hugged briefly, a careful embrace that carried 20 years of complicated history, but also expressed genuine relief at finally being face to face again. Should we go home? Emma suggested, breaking the emotional tension. "I want to show Robert the room Grandma fixed up for him." During the drive to the house, Emma kept asking Robert questions about his life in Memphis, showing a natural curiosity and a disarming way of making him feel comfortable. Margaret remained quieter, still processing the reality of having Robert back. When they arrived at the house, Robert was moved to see that everything was practically the same as he remembered. Margaret had kept the decor and furniture arrangement almost unchanged, as if preserving the memories of the time when they all lived together. "Your room is still the same," said Margaret, leading Robert to what had been the couple's bedroom. "I could never bring myself to change anything." Robert stepped into the room and felt transported back to the past. The bed, the wardrobe, even the curtains were the same. On the nightstand, there was still a photo of the whole family, taken one Christmas when Michael and Jennifer were little. "You kept our photos," Robert observed, picking up the frame. "I kept everything," Margaret admitted. "I could never let go of the memories of our family." "Neither could I," Robert said softly. "I took some photos with me when I left, and I always kept them close." Emma appeared at the bedroom door with a photo album in her hands. "Robert, do you want to see pictures of my mom when she was a teenager?" the girl asked. "Grandma showed me yesterday, and there are some with you in them." Robert sat on the bed beside Emma and began flipping through the album. Seeing pictures of Jennifer growing up brought back a wave of intense emotions. He had missed the chance to watch the daughter he raised become a woman, get married, and have a child. "She was very beautiful," Robert said, studying a photo of Jennifer at 18. "Everyone said she was gorgeous," Emma agreed, "and that she was really smart too." "She always was," Robert confirmed. "Even as a little girl, she asked questions that surprised me with how deep her thinking was. She married my dad when she was 23. Emma continued, turning the pages. "Look, this is their wedding photo." Robert looked at the photo of Jennifer's wedding and felt a mix of pride and sadness. Pride at seeing how she had become a beautiful, happy woman, and sadness at not being there for such an important moment in her life. "She looked stunning as a bride," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "Did you wish you could have been there?" Emma asked with the direct honesty of a child. "More than anything," Robert admitted. "I dreamed so." Many times of walking her down the aisle like any father would. Margaret, who had been listening from the doorway, came closer and sat on the other side of Emma. "She asked about you on her wedding day," Margaret said, surprising both Robert and Michael, who had just entered the room. "She did?" Robert asked, looking straight at Margaret. "That morning she said she missed you and wished you could have been there," Margaret explained. "I told her you were probably busy with your new life, but the truth is I didn't even know where you were. I was in Memphis working at the airport and thinking about all of you," Robert said. "If I'd known about the wedding, I would have found a way to be there, even if just to see her from a distance." "Why didn't you stay in touch all those years?" Emma asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Margaret and Robert exchanged glances, each waiting for the other to answer first. "Because I was too proud," Robert admitted finally. "And because I didn't know if I'd be welcome." "And I was too guilty," Margaret added. "I knew. I had created an unfair situation, but I couldn't find the courage to fix it." "Sometimes adults complicate things more than they need to," observed Emma, with surprising wisdom for her age. "That's true," agreed Michael. "And sometimes it's the children who show us the way to solve problems." The rest of the day passed more naturally than any of them had expected. Robert helped Margaret prepare lunch, rediscovering a domestic harmony that had been lost for decades. Emma bombarded him with questions about his life, his work, and his memories of Jennifer and Michael when they were little. During lunch, Margaret made Robert's favorite dish, a dried beef shepherd's pie she hadn't cooked in 20 years. The simple but meaningful gesture showed she had preserved not just memories, but also intimate knowledge of his tastes and preferences. "It's exactly the same," said Robert, tasting the food. "You didn't forget the recipe." "I never forgot anything about you," said Margaret, blushing slightly. After lunch, Michael suggested they take a walk around town so Robert could see how Riverside had changed during his absence. They visited the downtown area, which had been revitalized, the city park, now more beautiful and well-kept, and even the old workshop where Robert had worked before leaving. "The town has grown," Robert remarked as they walked through the main square. "But it's still our town," said Michael, "the place where our family was formed." "Do you think I could find work here again?" Robert asked suddenly. "The local airport always needs experienced mechanics," said Michael. "And you've already proven in Memphis how skilled you are." "It's a possibility," Robert said, more to himself than to the others. Emma, who had been listening, took Robert's hand. "Are you really thinking about coming home for good?" the girl asked. "I'm considering it," Robert admitted. "But it's a big decision. I need to be sure it's best for everyone." "It is best," Emma said without hesitation. "Our family is better when it's whole." That evening, after Emma went to bed, the three adults gathered in the living room for a deeper conversation about the future. Margaret had prepared coffee and cookies, creating a warm atmosphere for a discussion they all knew was necessary. "Robert, I need to apologize to you properly," Margaret began, "for what I did to our family, for the lies I told, for all the years we lost." "Margaret, you don't have to humble yourself," Robert said gently. "We all make mistakes when we're scared or confused." "But my mistakes cost our family dearly," Margaret insisted. "Michael spent 20 years hating you unfairly. Jennifer died without getting the chance to reconcile with you. Emma grew up without knowing the adoptive grandfather who would have loved her. And I lost the chance to raise Michael and Jennifer fully, to be there for the important moments in their lives," Robert added. "But carrying guilt won't change the past. What we can do is build a better future." "Do you two still love each other?" Michael asked, voicing the question that had been underlying the whole conversation. Margaret and Robert looked at each other silently for a few seconds, each searching within for the honest answer to such a complex question. "I never stopped loving Robert," Margaret said finally. "Even during the years we were apart, a part of me always belonged to him. And I could never fall in love with anyone else because a part of me was still here in this house, with this family," Robert admitted. "Then why are we wasting time?" Michael asked, smiling. "You have a second chance that many people never get. Why not take it?" "Because we're afraid," said Margaret honestly. "Afraid that we might not be the same people who fell in love so many years ago." "Of course we're not the same people," said Robert. "We're people who have been through hardships, who have learned from our mistakes, who have grown. That could be better, not worse." "Would you really come back to Riverside?" asked Margaret. "Would you leave your life in Memphis to start over here?" "My life in Memphis is lonely and incomplete," Robert replied. "No matter how much I've adapted, it was never truly a home. It was just a place where I was waiting to find the courage to come back." "And what if it doesn't work this time?" Margaret asked. "What if we find that the problems that drove us apart are still there?" "Then we'll face them together, like a mature family should," said Michael. "This time with honesty, no lies or secrets." "Emma would be happy," Margaret observed, thinking of her granddaughter. "Emma deserves to have a whole family," Robert agreed. "And we deserve the chance to make up for past mistakes." The three talked late into the night, planning how they could rebuild the family life that had been broken 2 decades before. They discussed practical matters, like Robert's job and living arrangements, but also the emotional challenges of healing old wounds. By the time they finally went to bed, they all felt something fundamental had changed. The possibility of reuniting their family was no longer just a distant dream. It was a real plan taking shape. The next morning, Emma woke up early and went to check if Robert was still in the house. She found him in the kitchen, making breakfast for everyone. "Good morning," Emma said, still in her pajamas. "Do you know how to make pancakes?" "I sure do," Robert replied with a smile. "They were your Uncle Michael's favorite breakfast when he was little." "Can you make some for us?" Emma asked, sitting at the kitchen table. "Of course," Robert said, gathering the ingredients, "but you'll have to help me. I don't remember the exact measurements." Emma and Robert worked together, making pancakes, falling into a natural rhythm that surprised them both. The girl asked how Robert had learned to cook, and he shared stories about weekends when he'd make special breakfasts for the family. "Did you like cooking for us?" Emma asked. "I loved it," Robert answered. "It was a way to show I cared." "When you cook for someone, you're saying you want to take care of them. And do you want to take care of us again?" Emma asked with the bluntness only children have. Very much, Robert admitted. If you'll let me. I will, Emma said immediately, and I'm sure Grandma and Uncle Michael will too. When Michael and Margaret came down for breakfast, they found Robert and Emma laughing in the kitchen, surrounded by the warm smell of fresh pancakes. The simple but touching scene made the two adults realize that Robert's return to the family was happening more naturally and faster than any of them had expected. Something smells wonderful, Margaret said, walking toward the stove. Robert made pancakes for everyone, Emma announced proudly, and I helped. She was an excellent assistant, Robert confirmed, drizzling syrup on a pancake and handing it to Emma. Over breakfast, Michael made an announcement that surprised them all. I've decided to cancel all my work trips for the next 2 weeks, he said. I want to stay here and help everyone adjust to being a family again. You don't have to do this, said Robert. I don't want you to hurt your business because of me. It's not because of you, corrected Michael. It's because of us, for our family. There are things more important than work. What do you mean? Asked Margaret. I'm going to use these 2 weeks to help Robert organize the move from Memphis if he really decides to come back, Michael explained. And I also want us to have time to talk about everything that happened, without rushing, without pressure. That's a good idea, Margaret agreed. This way we can all gradually get used to the changes. And I can teach Emma some of the recipes you all loved when you were little, added Robert, if she wants to learn. I do, exclaimed Emma, especially. That stroganoff Uncle Michael said was so delicious. The following week was one of the happiest the family had experienced in decades. Robert returned to Memphis only to organize his transfer and give notice at work, quickly coming back to Riverside with his most important belongings. During those days, he and Margaret rediscovered the relationship they had built years before. Now matured by the experiences each had lived separately, they realized they still knew each other deeply, but they had also grown and changed in ways that made them even more compatible. Michael spent valuable time getting to know William James better through conversations with Robert and reading the notebooks he had inherited. He began to understand not just where his flying talents came from, but also his personality and natural inclinations. Emma flourished under Robert's attention, who proved to be a kind and patient adoptive grandfather. He taught her how to make paper airplanes using techniques William James had taught him decades earlier, creating a connection between generations that transcended the complexities of their family history. One of the most touching moments of that week was when Robert took the whole family to visit William James's grave. It was the first time Michael had visited his biological father's resting place, and the experience was deeply emotional for everyone. Hi, William James, said Robert, kneeling near the headstone. I brought your son to meet you. He's become an incredible man, exactly the kind you would have been proud of. Michael knelt beside Robert and placed his hand on the headstone. Hi, Dad, said Michael for the first time in his life. I'm sorry it took me so long to visit you, but now I know who you were, and I'll try to honor your memory. Margaret cried silently, remembering the man she had loved and lost so young. Emma held her grandmother's hand, sensing this was an important moment for the whole family. William, James, your family is together again, said Margaret, stepping closer to the headstone. It took a long time, but we found our way back to each other. After the cemetery visit, the family went to a nearby diner William James used to frequent when he was young. Robert shared more stories about the friend he had lost, and Michael asked more questions about his biological father's personality and dreams. Do you think he would approve of the choices I've made in life? Asked Michael. I'm absolutely sure, replied Robert. He wanted you to become a pilot, and you did. He wanted you to be a man of integrity and responsibility, and he would be extremely proud. And what would he think of our family being together again? Asked Margaret. He would be happy, said Robert without hesitation. William James always believed that people who love each other find a way to stay together no matter what obstacles they face. At the end of the week, Robert made the final decision to return to Riverside permanently. He had managed to get a transfer to work at the local airport, and Michael had helped him find a small house near Margaret's. "Why don't you just come back to our house?" asked Margaret. "You've always been welcome here." "Because I want to do things right this time," Robert explained. "I want us to get to know each other again, without rushing until we're sure. This is what we want." "That's a wise decision," Michael agreed. "This way you both have time to rebuild your relationship without pressure." "And I can visit both places," said Emma, seeing the bright side of the situation. Robert's move was organized as a family event. Michael rented a small truck, and everyone helped transport his belongings from Memphis to Riverside. It was a symbolic way of showing that he was being welcomed back, not just by one person, but by the entire family. While setting up Robert's new home, many memories were shared. He had kept photos, letters, and items that had belonged to William James, and now he could share these treasures with Michael and the rest of the family. "This was your father's military uniform," Robert said, showing the carefully preserved outfit. "He wore it on the day of his pilot graduation." Michael touched the fabric with reverence, trying to picture William James wearing that uniform, young and full of dreams for the future. "Can I keep this with me?" Michael asked. "It's yours by right," Robert replied, "just like everything else that belonged to him." "No," Michael said, "I want you to keep being the guardian of his memory. You were his best friend, and you're the one who preserved all this over the years." "Then let's share," Robert suggested. "Some things stay with me, others with you. That way William James's memory lives on through the whole family." 2 months after Robert returned to Riverside, the family threw a party to celebrate what they called their family reunification. They invited close friends and neighbors who had followed their journey of separation and reconciliation. During the party, Margaret gave an emotional speech. "I want to publicly apologize to Robert and my children," she said, tears in her eyes. "My lies cost our family 20 years. But I also want to thank you for the second chance you've all given me." "Mom, the past is behind us," Michael said, hugging Margaret. "What matters is the present and the future we're building together." "It's true," Robert agreed, "and I want everyone to know that this family has taught me it's never too late to make things right and start over." Emma, who had grown so much during those intense months of family changes, also wanted to speak. "I've learned that sometimes kids have to help adults do the right thing," she said, making everyone laugh. "And that the truth is always better than a lie, even when it hurts." The party lasted late into the night with music, dancing, and many stories being shared. It was a celebration not just of their family reuniting, but also of the courage they had all shown in facing the truth and building something new from the ruins of the past. But in the middle of the festivities, a phone call completely changed the course of the evening. The phone rang insistently, and Michael answered, thinking it might be a neighbor complaining about the noise. "Hello," Michael said, stepping away from the music. "Michael Peterson?" asked a woman's voice he didn't recognize. "Yes, speaking. Who is this?" "My name is Rachel Wilson. I'm William James Wilson's niece," the woman said, making Michael's heart race instantly. Michael felt his legs go weak. It had never occurred to him that William James might have other living relatives, people who were also part of his family history. "How did you get my number?" Michael asked, trying to stay calm. "Through the Memphis International Airport," Rachel explained. "I work there as an administrator, and one of the mechanics told me a pilot from Riverside had been looking for information about my uncle a few months ago. It took me a while to get your contact details." "What do you want?" Michael asked, feeling a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "I want to meet you," Rachel said simply. "You're my cousin, the son my uncle William James never got the chance to know. Our family always knew about you." Michael looked around the party, Robert chatting animatedly with some neighbors, Grandma Margaret serving sweets to the children, and Emma playing with the guests' kids. Everything had finally fallen into place, and now a new complication had arisen. "Rachel, this isn't a good time to talk about this," Michael said. "We're in the middle of a family gathering." "I understand," Rachel replied. "But Michael, there's something you need to know about your father. Something that might change everything you believe about his death." "What do you mean?" Michael asked, a chill running down his spine. "I can't explain over the phone," Rachel said. "I need to meet you in person. It's about the circumstances of William James's death. There are things you were never told." Michael hung up in shock. Just when he thought he'd uncovered the whole truth about his family's past, someone appeared suggesting there were still secrets left to reveal. Robert noticed Michael's troubled expression and approached. "What happened?" he asked, concerned. "It was a relative of William James," Michael explained, still processing the call. "His niece, she works at the Memphis International Airport." "I didn't know William James had nieces," Robert said, confused. "He always said his family was small." "She said there's something about his death we don't know," Michael replied. "Something that could change everything." Robert paled. All these years, he had believed he knew every detail about the accident that killed William James. If there was more to it, why had he never heard of it? "Are you going to meet her?" Robert asked. "I don't know," Michael admitted honestly. "I'm afraid of what she might reveal. Our family just came back together. What if this information tears us apart again? Or what if it finally answers questions that never made sense?" Robert suggested. Michael glanced at the party, still lively despite the serious conversation he and Robert were having in the corner. Grandma Margaret was laughing at something, Emma had said, and the whole atmosphere was one of happiness and harmony. "I don't want to ruin what we've built," Michael said. "But can you live in peace without knowing the truth?" Robert asked, knowing Michael's nature well. "Probably not," Michael admitted. The party ended a few hours later, with all the guests praising the family for their courage in facing past troubles and rebuilding relationships. But Michael spent the rest of the night restless, thinking about Rachel's call and what she might reveal. The next morning, he decided to tell Grandma Margaret and Emma about the phone call. They reacted differently. Grandma Margaret was worried about the possibility of more unsettling revelations, while Emma showed natural curiosity. "Do you think she's telling the truth?" Grandma Margaret asked. "I don't know why she'd lie," Michael replied, "but I also don't know what to expect from this conversation." "Maybe it's better to let the past stay in the past," suggested Margaret, clearly uneasy. "Grandma, if there's a truth we don't know, it's better to find out," said Emma with the simple wisdom of children. "Secrets always cause trouble." Robert agreed with Emma. "The girl is right," he said. "We've seen what happens when we hide things from each other." Michael spent the whole day wrestling with whether or not to arrange a meeting with Rachel. Finally, by late afternoon, he decided he needed to know the truth no matter the consequences. He called Rachel and set up a meeting for the next day at a cafe in downtown Riverside. She said she'd traveled from Memphis just for this conversation, which made Michael realize the matter was truly serious. That night, Michael barely slept. He kept imagining what kind of revelation Rachel might have about William James and how it could shake the emotional stability the family had worked so hard to build. The next morning, Michael arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early. He was nervous and couldn't focus on anything. When Rachel walked in, he recognized her immediately. She bore a striking resemblance to the photos of William James he'd seen. Rachel was a woman in her 40s, with wavy brown hair and the same green eyes Michael had inherited from William James. She was visibly emotional when she saw him. "Michael?" Rachel asked, approaching the table where he sat. "That's me," Michael replied, standing to greet her. The two embraced hesitantly, acknowledging a family bond neither had known existed. "You look just like my uncle did at your age," Rachel said, studying Michael's face. "The resemblance is uncanny." "You said yesterday there's something about his death I don't know," Michael said, getting straight to the point. "What is it?" Rachel took a deep breath before answering. "William James didn't die in a routine training accident," she said. "He was investigating wrongdoing at the airbase where he worked. He'd uncovered a corruption scheme involving high-ranking officers." Michael felt like the ground had disappeared beneath him. "What do you mean?" he asked. "My uncle was a man of integrity. He couldn't stay silent when he saw something wrong," Rachel explained. "He'd found out some officers were siphoning aviation fuel and selling it on the black market. When he tried to report it, he started receiving threats." "You think his death wasn't an accident?" Michael asked, his stomach twisting. "I don't have concrete proof," Rachel admitted, "but the circumstances were suspicious. William James was one of the best pilots at the base, not the type to make basic mistakes that cause crashes." Why didn't you ever tell anyone? Michael asked. Because I was only 15 when he died and my family was scared, Rachel said. After his death, the officers involved in the scheme were transferred to other bases, and the whole thing was swept under the rug. Why tell me now? Michael asked. Because now I have access to documents I didn't before, Rachel said. I've worked in airport administration for 15 years, and recently I made contacts that helped me dig deeper into what really happened back then. Rachel pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on the cafe table. These are copies of internal reports from the airbase where William James worked, she said. Documents that only surfaced years after his death. Michael opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were official reports, copies of correspondence, and even testimonies from other military personnel who worked at the base at the time. What exactly do these documents prove? Asked Michael. They prove that William James had filed formal complaints about irregularities 2 weeks before he died, explained Rachel, and that his accident happened exactly when he was about to submit evidence to an external investigation committee. Michael read some of the documents and was shocked to discover that William James had been far braver and more principled than anyone had imagined. His biological father wasn't just a talented pilot, but also a man of integrity who had risked his life to do what was right. Rachel, even if all this is true, what can we do now? Asked Michael. William James has been dead for over 40 years. We can clear his name, said Rachel, and we can also make sure those responsible don't escape justice forever. How so? Asked Michael. 2 of the officers involved in the scheme are still alive, explained Rachel. They retired as colonels, receive military pensions, and are considered heroes in their communities. If we can prove what they did, they could lose everything. Michael fell silent for a few minutes, processing everything he'd just learned. The idea that William James might have been the victim of a crime, not an accident, completely changed his understanding of his family's history. What do you want me to do? Michael finally asked. I want you to help me gather more evidence, said Rachel. As William James's son, you have the legal right to request information I couldn't access on my own. Could this be dangerous? Michael asked, thinking of the family he'd just reunited with. It could, Rachel admitted, but it might also be the only chance to get justice for your father. Michael spent the rest of the morning talking with Rachel, learning more about the paternal family he never knew existed. He discovered that William James had a younger brother who had died young, and that Rachel was that brother's daughter. Why did our family never try to find me before? Asked Michael. Because we didn't know where you were, explained Rachel. After William James died, we lost contact with your mother. We knew she'd remarried, but we had no information about where you lived. And you didn't try to look? Asked Michael. My grandparents tried a few times, but they always ran into bureaucratic roadblocks, said Rachel. Remember, this happened in the 80s. There was no internet, and finding people was much harder. When they said goodbye, Rachel left all the documents with Michael and asked him to think carefully before deciding whether to get involved in the investigation into William James's death. Michael, I'll understand if you want to let this go, said Rachel. You have a family to protect, and stirring up these issues could bring complications. I'll talk to my family and give you an answer in a few days, said Michael. When he got home, Michael found Robert, Margaret, and Emma eager to hear what Rachel had revealed. He told them the whole story, showing them the documents he'd received. My goodness, said Margaret, flipping through the papers. If this is true, William James was far braver than any of us ever imagined. And it also means he might have died for doing the right thing, added Robert, clearly moved. Uncle Michael, are you going to help Rachel uncover the truth? Asked Emma. I don't know, sweetheart, Michael replied. It's a very big decision, one that could affect our whole family. Why would it affect us? Asked Emma. Because if we start an investigation into William James's death, we might end up stirring up powerful people who don't want the truth to come out, explained Robert. But isn't our safety more important than that? Asked Margaret, clearly worried. Michael spent the following days in a terrible dilemma. On one hand, he felt he owed it to William James's memory to seek the truth about his death. On the other, he didn't want to risk the family he had worked so hard to bring together. The situation grew even more complicated when Michael received a threatening call from a man who identified himself only as a friend of the nation's interests. "Mr. Peterson, we've heard you're meddling in matters that don't concern you," said the authoritative male voice on the other end of the line. "Who is this?" asked Michael, his heart racing. "That doesn't matter," the man replied. "What matters is that you understand it would be much better for your family if you forgot certain curiosities about the past." "Are you threatening me?" Michael asked. "I'm offering friendly advice," the man said. "You have a young niece, an elderly mother, and a thriving business. It would be a shame if something disrupted the stability of your life." The call ended abruptly, leaving Michael in shock. The threats confirmed Rachel's suspicions about a corruption scheme, but they also made it clear that investigating further would be dangerous. Michael told his family about the threatening call, causing a divide in opinions on how to proceed. "Now we know for sure there's something to hide," said Robert. "Innocent people don't make threats." "But we also know it's dangerous to keep digging," argued Margaret. "Michael, you can't put Emma at risk." "Maybe we should go to the police," Michael suggested. "The police won't get involved in military crimes from 40 years ago," Robert said realistically. "And besides, we don't know if we can trust any local authorities." The family spent several nights debating what to do. Emma, despite her age, participated in the discussions with surprising maturity. "Uncle Michael, what would Grandpa William James do if he were in your place?" she asked during one of these talks. The question made Michael reflect deeply. Based on everything he had learned about William James, he knew his biological father wouldn't have backed down from threats when it came to doing what was right. "He would fight for the truth," Michael admitted, "even knowing the risks." "Then maybe that's the answer," Emma said simply. But before Michael could make a final decision, the situation escalated further. Rachel called to say her house in Memphis had been broken into, and all the original documents about William James had been stolen. "They only took the papers related to your father," Rachel explained, clearly frightened. "They left everything else untouched. This proves someone is very interested in keeping those secrets hidden." "Rachel, are you okay? Are you safe?" Michael asked, concerned. "I'm physically fine, but I'm scared," Rachel admitted. "Michael, I think we should stop here. It might not be safe to continue." "Or maybe that's exactly why we should keep going," Michael said, surprising himself with his determination. "What do you mean?" Rachel asked. "If they're this desperate to hide the truth, it means it's powerful," Michael explained. "Maybe this is our only chance to get justice for William James." "But now we don't have the evidence anymore," Rachel said. "They took everything." "They didn't take the copies you gave me," Michael replied. "And if they exist, other similar documents must also be somewhere." Rachel fell silent for a few seconds, considering Michael's words. "What are you proposing?" asked Rachel. "That we keep investigating, but more carefully," said Michael, "and that we seek help from people who can actually protect us." "What kind of people?" asked Rachel. "Investigative journalists, human rights lawyers, maybe even non-governmental. Organizations that deal with military crimes," Michael suggested. "It's a possibility," Rachel agreed, "but it'll take a lot of time and effort." "William James deserves that effort," Michael said with conviction. When Michael told the family about his decision to continue the investigation, the reactions were mixed. Margaret was worried about the risks. Robert supported the pursuit of justice, and Emma admired her uncle's courage. "Michael, are you sure you want to get involved in this?" Margaret asked. "Our lives were finally getting back to normal." "Mum, normal based on lies isn't really normal," Michael replied. "If there's a chance to get justice for William James, I have to try." "But what if something happens to you?" Margaret asked, tears in her eyes. "Nothing will happen," Michael said, trying to reassure her. "We'll be very careful and get professional help." Robert offered to assist with the investigation, though Margaret and Emma were also concerned for his safety. "William James was my best friend," Robert said. "If he was killed for doing what was right, I can't just ignore it. But you both have to promise you'll be extremely careful," Emma insisted. "I don't want to lose any more family members." Michael and Robert began their investigation by reaching out to an investigative journalist from New York known for exposing military corruption cases. The man, named David Mitchell, was in his 60s and had dedicated his career to investigating crimes other journalists wouldn't touch. "You know you're stirring up a hornet's nest, right?" David said after hearing the whole story. "Cases involving the military are always complicated, especially old ones. We know the risks," Michael said, "but we also know it's the right thing to do." "And do you have solid evidence?" David asked. Michael showed him the copies of the documents Rachel had given him. David examined the papers carefully, asking specific questions about dates, names, and circumstances. "This is very serious," David finally said. "If these documents are authentic, you have evidence of a crime that could still have implications today." "Can you help us?" Robert asked. "I can," David said, "but I'll need time to verify the document's authenticity and look for additional evidence. And you'll have to prepare yourselves. This could turn into a very long and complex investigation." David explained that cases like this took months or even years to investigate because they involved people who had spent decades hiding evidence and silencing witnesses. "Besides, you could become targets of even more intense intimidation," he warned. "People willing to kill to keep secrets won't hesitate to use other methods to stop investigations." "What do you recommend?" Michael asked. "That you temporarily relocate somewhere safe while I do the initial investigation," David said, "and that you don't discuss this with anyone except me and Rachel." The suggestion of leaving home temporarily caused another family crisis. Margaret didn't want to leave Riverside after just reuniting the family, and Emma was afraid of having to change schools again. "How long would we have to stay away?" asked Margaret. "David said the initial investigation could take a few months," replied Michael. "But if the threats continue, we might need to stay longer." "What about my job?" asked Robert. "I just got hired at the local airport." "Maybe you could take a temporary leave," suggested Michael, "or work remotely on some consulting projects." "What about my school?" asked Emma, worried. "We can enroll you temporarily in a school in New York," said Michael. "It would only be for a few months." The family spent several days debating the decision. Finally, after receiving a second threatening call, this time specifically targeting Emma, they realized they had no choice. "They mentioned Emma by name," said Michael, clearly disturbed. "They know where she goes to school, what time she gets out. We can't ignore this level of threat." "All right," said Margaret, resigned. "We'll go to New York temporarily, but I want to come home as soon as this is over." "Of course we'll come back," promised Michael. "This is our home, our town. No one's going to drive us away permanently." The temporary move to New York was arranged quickly. David helped the family find a secure apartment in a residential neighborhood and set up basic safety measures. Emma was enrolled in a nearby school. Robert picked up some temporary consulting work, and Margaret adjusted to city life with the quiet acceptance of someone who had weathered many changes before. For the first few months in New York, the family maintained a cautious but relatively normal routine. Michael made weekly trips to check on David's investigation, which was progressing slowly but uncovering important details. "I've confirmed the authenticity of the documents you had," David said during one of their meetings, "and I've also found evidence that the corruption scheme was much bigger than William James had uncovered." "What do you mean?" asked Michael. "The fuel theft was just a small part of an operation involving arms sales, falsified reports, even industrial espionage," David explained. "William James had stumbled onto something very dangerous. And the people responsible?" asked Michael. "Two of the main officers have already died of natural causes," said David. "But the third, retired Colonel Richard Augustus Stewart, is still alive and living in Washington." "Does he still have the power to hurt us?" asked Michael. "He has important political connections," David admitted. "But he also has a lot to lose if the truth comes out. He receives a generous military pension and advises several defense contractors." David explained he was trying to find surviving witnesses willing to talk about what they'd seen at the airbase around the time of William James's death. "I've located 3 former servicemen who were stationed there at the time," said David. 2 agreed to give off the record statements, but the third is too afraid to talk. "What did their accounts reveal?" asked Michael. "That William James had received explicit threats days before he died," said David, "and that his accident happened under very suspicious circumstances, with witnesses being quickly transferred to other bases. The information David uncovered confirmed Rachel's suspicions, but also made it clear that proving William James's murder would be far harder than anyone had imagined. "How much longer do you think you'll need to gather enough evidence?" asked Michael. "At least another 6 months," David replied. "And that's if we can find witnesses willing to speak publicly. And if we can't?" asked Michael. "Then we'll have strong circumstantial evidence, but perhaps not enough for a criminal indictment," admitted David. Michael returned to New York with mixed feelings. On one hand, he was proud to be fighting for William James's memory. On the other, he was beginning to question whether the personal and family costs were worth it. Life in New York was becoming difficult for the whole family. Emma missed her friends from Riverside. Grandma Margaret was depressed from being away from home, and Robert was struggling to adjust to the big city's different routine. "Uncle Michael, when can we go back home?" Emma asked during a particularly tense dinner. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," Michael replied, seeing the sadness in the girl's eyes. "David needs more time to finish the investigation." "But I don't want to stay here forever," Emma said, starting to cry. "I want to go back to my school, my friends, my home." "I want to go back too," said Margaret, hugging her granddaughter. "Michael, maybe it's time to reconsider this investigation." "What do you mean?" asked Michael. "Maybe it's not worth destroying our present lives over injustices from the past," Margaret said. "William James has been dead for over 40 years. Nothing we discover will bring him back. But it could stop those responsible from escaping unpunished," Michael argued. "And it could also destroy the family we've just reunited," Margaret countered. "Michael, look at Emma, look at all of us. We're suffering because of this investigation." Robert, who had remained quiet during the discussion, finally spoke. "Margaret is right," he said, surprising Michael. "William James was my best friend, and I want to see justice done. But he wouldn't have wanted his pursuit of justice to destroy his family's happiness." "Do you want me to give up?" Michael asked, feeling confused. "We want you to think about whether this fight is worth the sacrifices we're making," Margaret said. "And we want you to remember that family is more important than anything else." That night, Michael lay awake for hours, reflecting on the dilemmas he faced. He knew Margaret and Robert were right about the family costs of the investigation, but he also felt that giving up would be a betrayal of William James's memory. The next morning, he decided to have an honest conversation with Rachel about the possibility of stopping the investigation. "Rachel, my family is suffering because of this situation," Michael explained. "We're living like refugees, far from home in constant fear. I don't know if I can keep going like this." "I understand," Rachel said, though it was obvious she was disappointed. "I've been thinking about giving up too. The threats I've received were very explicit." "What did David say about quitting now?" Michael asked. "He said he'd respect our decision, but it would be a shame to waste the work we've already done," Rachel replied. "He believes he's close to a major breakthrough." "What kind of breakthrough?" Michael asked. "He made contact with the widow of one of the officers involved in the scheme," Rachel explained. "The woman has documents her husband kept as insurance, and she seems willing to hand them over." The news that David was close to definitive evidence made Michael's decision even harder. Giving up now would mean wasting months of work, and perhaps losing forever the chance to bring justice for William James. "How much time does David need to get those documents?" Michael asked. "A few weeks at most," Rachel answered. "The widow is ill and wants to settle this before she dies." Michael returned home and gathered the family to explain the situation. The news that the investigation might be nearing its end brought mixed reactions. "If it's just a few more weeks, maybe we can hold on," said Emma, showing impressive maturity. "But what if those few weeks turn into months again?" asked Margaret skeptically. "Then we set a deadline," suggested Robert. "We give David one more month to get that evidence. If he doesn't succeed, we go back to Riverside and close the investigation." "That's a reasonable proposal," Michael agreed. "1 month and then we go home no matter the outcome." The family agreed to the 1-month deadline, and Michael relayed the decision to David and Rachel. The journalist understood the time constraint and promised to focus all his efforts on obtaining the widow's documents. The following weeks were tense for the entire family. Everyone knew this was the investigation's last chance. If it failed, They would return to Riverside without definitive answers about William James's death. Michael anxiously followed David's progress, who reported almost daily advances and setbacks. The widow was willing to hand over the documents, but was being pressured by her own children not to get involved. Her children are afraid of retaliation, David explained, but she insists she wants to do the right thing before she dies. What exactly do these documents contain? Michael asked. According to her, they're photographs of official records proving the officer's involvement in the corruption scheme, including specific orders to silence William James, David said. Would that be enough for a criminal charge? It would be very strong evidence, David confirmed, especially combined with the testimonies we've already gathered. With just 1 week left before the family's deadline, David finally met the widow in person. The woman, named Hope Stewart, was 85 years old and clearly ill, but she was determined to reveal the secrets her husband had kept for decades. My husband died carrying a terrible guilt, Hope explained to David. He knew William James, was innocent, but never had the courage to speak the truth. Why did he keep these documents? David asked. As protection, Hope said. He knew if anyone tried to hold him accountable for what happened, he could use these papers to prove he was just following orders. The documents Hope gave David were even more revealing than anyone had expected. Not only did they prove the existence of the corruption scheme, but they also contained clear evidence that William James had been murdered to prevent him from handing over evidence to an external investigation committee. Here's the direct order to neutralize the threat posed by Lieutenant William James Wilson, David said, showing one of the photographs to Michael. Neutralize? Michael asked, feeling sick. It's a military euphemism for murder, David explained. And it's signed by Colonel Richard Augustus Stewart, the same man who's still alive. Is this enough for a charge? It's enough for a lot of things, David said, smiling for the first time in months. We have evidence of murder, conspiracy, military corruption, and a cover-up. Richard Augustus Stewart will spend the rest of his life in prison. The news that there was finally conclusive evidence about William James's murder brought complicated emotions for Michael. On one hand, he felt relief knowing the truth was finally coming to light. On the other, he was furious to realize his father had been deliberately killed for doing what was right. Michael returned to New York with the evidence David had gathered and called the family together to share the discoveries. The reactions were intense and varied. So, William James was really murdered, said Margaret, crying. He died trying to do the right thing. And the guilty ones lived free for 40 years, never paying for what they did, added Robert, clearly outraged. But will they pay now? Asked Emma. David believes so, replied Michael. The evidence is too strong to ignore. What happens next? Asked Margaret. David will hand over the evidence to the federal attorney's office, Michael explained. They'll open a formal investigation, and if all goes well, they'll file criminal charges against Richard Augustus Stewart. How long will that take? Asked Robert. Months, maybe years, admitted Michael. But the important thing is the legal process will begin, and our part in the investigation is over. Does that mean we can go home? Asked Emma, hope in her voice. It means we can go home, Michael confirmed, smiling. The news that they could finally return to Riverside brought a celebratory atmosphere to the family. After months of living in fear and uncertainty, they could finally rebuild their normal lives. But before leaving New York, the family received an unexpected visit. Rachel arrived with an elderly woman she introduced as Dorothy Wilson, William James's mother and Michael's grandmother. How is that possible? Asked Michael, confused. Robert told me she had passed away. I said that because it's what I believed, explained Robert, equally surprised. Martha, the mother of William James I knew, really did die. But we found out William James was adopted as a baby. I'm his birth mother, explained Dorothy, a 90-year-old woman with remarkable vitality for her age. I had to give him up for adoption when I was young, but I never stopped following his life from afar. And you knew about me? Asked Michael, emotional. I did, Dorothy confirmed, tears in her eyes. I always knew I had a grandson, but I could never find a way to reach out without causing confusion. Why come forward now? Asked Michael. Because Rachel told me about the investigation into my son's death, Dorothy explained, and because I have information that might help. What kind of information? Asked Michael. William James came to me just days before he died, Dorothy revealed. He'd found out he was adopted and wanted to meet his birth family. We planned to meet the following week, but he died before then. What did he say when he spoke to you? Asked Michael. He said he was worried about his safety, Dorothy explained. He told me he'd uncovered bad things about his superiors and was thinking of requesting a transfer from the airbase. Did you tell anyone about this at the time? Asked Robert. I tried, said Dorothy, but no one took me seriously. An old woman talking about military conspiracies wasn't seen as a reliable source. Dorothy's information provided another piece of the puzzle about William James's final days. David was very interested in her testimony and included it in the dossier he was preparing for the federal attorney's office. Mrs. Dorothy, would you be willing to give a formal statement about this conversation? Asked David. Of course, Dorothy replied without hesitation. I've waited 40 years to speak the truth about this. With Dorothy's testimony completing the evidence against Richard Augustus Stewart, David finally submitted the full dossier to the authorities. The case gained media attention and within weeks became one of the most talked about military scandals in the country. The family was finally able to return to Riverside, but now with an additional member. Dorothy had decided to move to the city to stay close to the family she had reunited with after so many years. I missed the chance to know my son, Dorothy said, but I won't miss the chance to know my grandson and my great-granddaughter. The return to Riverside was emotional for everyone. The house had been cared for by neighbors during the family's absence, and everything was exactly as they had left it. Emma ran to her room, happy to be reunited with her toys and books. Margaret returned to her kitchen with visible relief. Robert resumed his work at the local airport, and Michael restarted his activities as a pilot and sales representative. But the experience in New York had changed the whole family. They had learned about courage, the importance of truth, and how it's possible to face adversity with the support of loved ones. Uncle Michael, do you regret investigating Grandpa William James's death? Emma asked a few months after they returned home. I don't regret it, Michael answered honestly. It was hard, it was dangerous, but it was the right thing to do. And was it worth it? Emma asked. It was, Michael confirmed. William James deserved to have the truth about his death known. And now we all know what kind of brave man he was. The criminal case against Richard Augustus Stewart followed its course in court. The former colonel was held in custody while awaiting trial, and several others involved in the corruption scheme were also indicted. The story gained so much attention that William James's case became a symbol of the fight against military impunity in the United States. David wrote a book about the investigation, and the case was the subject of documentaries and special reports. But for the family, the most important thing wasn't the public attention, it was the feeling that they had finally brought justice for William James. His memory had been cleared, and his sacrifice for integrity had been recognized. A year after returning to Riverside, the family organized a special ceremony at William James's grave. Present were Michael, Margaret, Robert, Emma, Dorothy, Rachel, and several friends who had supported the family throughout the investigation. William James, your son did for you what you couldn't do for yourself, Dorothy said, speaking near the headstone. He fought for the truth and made sure justice was served. Dad, I hope wherever you are, you know your family is finally whole and at peace, Michael said, placing flowers on the grave. Grandpa, thank you for being such a brave man, Emma said. Uncle Michael learned from you how to fight for what's right. The ceremony was simple but moving. Each family member had the chance to speak to William James, to thank him for his legacy of courage and integrity. After the ceremony, the family returned home and gathered for a special lunch. The table was filled with everyone's favorite dishes, lovingly prepared by Margaret and Dorothy working together. You know what's the most amazing thing about this whole story? Robert said during lunch. What? Michael asked. It all started with Emma finding some old papers in the attic, Robert said, laughing. Her 10-year-old girl uncovered secrets that had been hidden for 40 years. And if she hadn't found those documents, Margaret asked. I probably would never have known the truth about William James, Michael said, and you all would never have reconciled. And Richard Augustus Stewart would have died unpunished, Rachel added. That's why there are no coincidences, Dorothy said with the wisdom of her 90 years. There are only things that are meant to happen when the time is right. Grandma Dorothy is right, agreed Emma. Everything happened at the right time. Uncle Michael discovered the truth when he was ready for it. The family came together when everyone was mature enough to forgive, and justice was served when the right evidence came to light. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. 2 years after the investigation ended, Michael made a decision that surprised the whole family. He announced he was selling his sales representation business to open a flight school in Riverside. It's time to fulfill the dream William James never could, Michael explained. He wanted to teach others how to fly. Now I'll do it for him. Are you sure? Asked Margaret. Your current business is doing very well. I'm certain, Michael confirmed. I've learned there are things more important than money. Teaching people to fly is a way to honor my father's memory and find more meaning in my own life. The flight school opened 6 months later at a ceremony attended by the whole family and many friends. Michael named it the William James Wilson Aviation Institute, ensuring his father's name would be remembered by future generations of pilots. Dad, your flight school finally exists, Michael said during the opening ceremony, and through it, you'll keep teaching people to touch the sky. The institute quickly gained recognition in the region for its high-quality instruction and the humanistic philosophy Michael had implemented. Beyond flight techniques, students learned about ethics, responsibility, and the importance of always doing what's right. Robert became a mechanics instructor at the school, sharing the knowledge he'd gained over decades of working with aircraft. Emma, now 13, visited on weekends and holidays, learning the basics of aviation. Uncle Michael, when I grow up, I'll be a pilot just like you and Grandpa William James, Emma declared during one of her visits. If that's what you truly want, I'll teach you everything I know, Michael promised. But remember, the most important thing isn't knowing how to fly, but knowing why you fly. What do you mean? Emma asked. William James flew because he loved freedom and wanted to serve his country, Michael explained. I fly because I love teaching and helping others achieve their dreams. You'll need to find your own reason to fly. Margaret and Dorothy became the school's official grandmothers, handling administrative tasks and offering emotional support to struggling students. Despite their age difference, the two women developed a deep friendship rooted in their shared love for family. It's funny how life teaches us lessons when we least expect it, Margaret said to Dorothy one afternoon while organizing school documents. How so? Dorothy asked. I spent my whole life afraid of the truth, making up lies to protect the people I loved, Margaret explained. In the end, I learned the truth is always better, even when it hurts. And I spent decades hiding. Out of shame for giving up my son for adoption, Dorothy said. In the end, I learned nothing matters more than family, and it's never too late to rebuild relationships. Rachel continued living in Memphis, but visited Riverside regularly to follow the school's progress and stay connected with the family she'd reunited with. She became a kind of ambassador for the Institute, referring students and helping spread the word about the work being done. The criminal case against Richard Augustus Stewart came to an end 3 years after it began. The former colonel was sentenced to 20 years in prison for murder, conspiracy, and military corruption. Several others involved in the scheme also received prison sentences. Justice has been served, David said to Michael on the day of the sentencing. William James can rest in peace, and our family can move forward knowing we did the right thing, Michael replied. Richard Augustus Stewart's conviction had significant repercussions in the United States Air Force, leading to reforms in internal investigation procedures and protections for military personnel who report misconduct. William James, 40 years after his death, had finally achieved what he had tried to do in life: expose corruption and ensure that honorable servicemen could serve their country without fear of retaliation. On the 5th anniversary of the aviation school's opening, the family organized a grand celebration. Hundreds of former students returned to honor Michael and share stories about how the school had changed their lives. During the festivities, Michael gave an emotional speech. "5 years ago, when I opened this school, I thought I was honoring my father's memory," Michael said. "But I realized I was doing much more than that. I was building a legacy that will last forever." "How so?" asked one of the former students. "Because everyone who learns to fly here takes with them not just technical knowledge, but also values of integrity and courage," Michael explained. "And when those people teach others, William James's legacy keeps multiplying." "And what have you learned these past 5 years?" another former student asked. "I've learned that family isn't just about blood, but about choice," Michael said, looking at Robert, Margaret, Emma, and Dorothy. "I've learned that the truth is always worth fighting for, even when it's hard. And I've learned that it's never too late to right the wrongs of the past and build a better future." Emma, now 16 and already taking flying lessons, also wanted to speak during the celebration. "I want to thank my Uncle Michael for teaching me that sometimes kids have to help adults do the right thing," Emma said, making everyone laugh. "And I want to thank my great-grandfather William James, who I never met, but who taught me that courage means doing what's right, even when it's dangerous." "What are your plans for the future?" someone in the crowd asked. "I'll become a pilot, of course," Emma said. "But I also want to study law so I can help other families fight for the truth." "And after that?" Michael asked, proud of his niece's determination. "Then I'll come back here and help." "You all continue Grandpa William James's work," Emma replied. "This school will pass from generation to generation, always teaching people to fly with integrity." The party lasted late into the night, with music, dancing, and countless stories shared. It was a celebration not just of the school's success, but of the extraordinary family forged through adversity and united by their pursuit of truth. When all the guests had left, the family gathered in Michael's living room for a more intimate conversation. "Do you think William James would be proud of what we've built?" Michael asked. "I'm absolutely certain," Dorothy replied. "My son always dreamed of making a difference in the world. Through all of you, he did." "What amazes me most is how everything connected," Robert said. "The search for the truth about William James brought us together as a family, and now that family is honoring his memory through the school." "It's like a circle closing," Margaret observed. "Not closing," Emma corrected, "opening. Because now other families will discover their own truths through the pilots we train here." "The girl is right," said Rachel, who had stayed for the intimate conversation. "You've created something that will last forever." "And it all started with a 10-year-old girl yelling at her uncle not to take off," Michael recalled, smiling at Emma. "And a family brave. Enough to face the truth even when it was hard," Emma added. "And a man who sacrificed his own life to do what was right," said Dorothy, thinking of William James. "And friends who became family," said Robert, looking around at everyone. "And a second chance that turned mistakes into wisdom," said Margaret. That night, while everyone slept, Michael went out to the backyard and gazed at the starry sky. He thought of William James, the father he'd never known, but who had deeply influenced his life. He thought of the family he'd lost and found again. He thought of the students he'd taught and those he would still teach. And he understood that William James's true legacy wasn't in the documents that had revealed his unjust death, but in the courage he'd inspired in his family to always do what was right, no matter the obstacles. The next morning, Michael woke up early and went to the school as he always did. He found Emma already there, studying aviation manuals in the library they'd created in honor of William James. "Good morning, Uncle," Emma said, not lifting her eyes from the books. "Good morning, dear," Michael replied. "Studying early today?" "I want to be ready for the private pilot exam next month," Emma explained. "You'll pass," Michael said with absolute certainty. "You have William James's talent and our family's determination. And I have the best teachers in the world," Emma added, finally looking up at Michael. "William James would be so proud to see his great-granddaughter following in his footsteps," Michael said. "I'm not following in his footsteps," Emma corrected. "I'm making my own, inspired by his example." Michael smiled, realizing Emma had perfectly grasped what the school aimed to teach. It wasn't about imitating heroes of the past, but about being inspired by them to create a better future. As other students began arriving for morning classes, Michael and Emma welcomed them as they always did, with enthusiasm and dedication. Another day was beginning at the William James Wilson Aviation Institute, another day of teaching people to fly with integrity and courage. And somewhere among the clouds, Michael was certain William James was smiling, seeing how his unjust death had turned into abundant life for so many. The school continued to grow and thrive over the years. Emma graduated as a pilot with the highest marks in her class, and indeed returned to help with the Institute's administration. Margaret and Dorothy lived to see hundreds of students graduate and begin careers in aviation. Robert retired as the school's lead instructor, but still taught occasional classes because he loved it too much to stop completely. Rachel moved to Riverside and became the Institute's administrative director. David wrote several more books about cases of injustice, always crediting the William James case as the one that changed his perspective on the importance of family in the search for truth. And every time a new student asked why the school was named the William James Wilson Aviation Institute, Michael told the full story, about a brave pilot who died defending integrity, about a family that was lost and found again, about a girl who shouted to stop a flight and ended up changing so many lives. Aviation isn't just about flying, Michael explained to each new class. It's about having the courage to rise above difficulties and always seek the truth even when it's hidden in the clouds. And so, Emma's desperate cry that morning at the airport, "Uncle, don't take off in the plane," echoed through the years, transforming into hundreds of safe flights, reunited families, justice served, and dreams fulfilled. William James had finally achieved his aviation school. Robert had reunited with his family. Margaret had learned that the truth is always better than a lie. Emma had discovered that children can change the world when they have the courage to do what's right. And Michael had come to understand that sometimes you must almost lose everything to discover what truly matters. Family, truth, integrity, and the courage to fly toward what's right, even when the destination is uncertain. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of the story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave your sincere words in the comments. Do you think Michael made the right decision in investigating William James's death? We'd love to read your opinion. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other thrilling stories.